The year is 1892. It is April, and somewhere in the gray waters of the North Atlantic, a steamship is crossing toward a land that most of its passengers have never seen. Good evening, and welcome to the archives. I am glad you have found your way here, to this quiet corner of the night, where history speaks in whispers, and time moves as slowly as a ship crossing an ocean. Whether you have come seeking sleep or simply seeking stillness, you are welcome here. You are safe here. And for the next few hours, we shall journey together across the Atlantic, in the company of those who made this crossing more than a century ago. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a quiet mark in the comments below. Tell me the city you're listening from, and the time on your clock. Perhaps it is midnight where you are, or perhaps the small hours before dawn. Perhaps you are in New York, where the ships once arrived, or perhaps you are in Naples, or Hamburg, or a village in Ireland, whose name has been forgotten by all, but those who once called it home. It does not matter. We are all travelers tonight, crossing the same dark waters, and the past is waiting for us just beyond the horizon. Let us begin. Between 1880 and 1924, more than 25 million people crossed the Atlantic Ocean to reach the shores of the United States. They came from every corner of Europe, from Ireland and Germany, from Italy and Poland, from Russia and Greece, and the villages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They came fleeing famine and persecution, poverty and war. They came carrying everything they owned in wooden trunks and cloth bundles, leaving behind parents and siblings and lovers they would never see again. Most of them traveled in steerage, the lowest and cheapest class of accommodation on the great steamships that plied the Atlantic routes. For a fare of $25 to $30, roughly half a year's wages for a laborer in southern Italy, they purchased a passage that would take them from the old world to the new. The journey lasted anywhere from 8 to 14 days, depending on the weather, the season, and the speed of the vessel. For those 8 to 14 days, they lived in conditions that would seem almost unimaginable to us now. Crowded into the bowels of the ship, sleeping in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, breathing air that grew thicker and fouler with each passing hour. This is not a tale of adventure. This is not a tale of triumph. This is a tale of endurance, of the small repetitions and discomforts that filled the days and nights of those who made this journey. We shall follow one of them tonight, a young woman named Maria Benedetto, from the village of Monteleone in the province of Calabria, who boarded a ship in Naples in the spring of 1892 and crossed the ocean to a country she knew only from the letters her brother had sent home. The night is long, the sea is wide, and the story is waiting to begin. The village of Monteleone sat on a hillside in Calabria, in the far south of Italy, where the land was dry and rocky, and the olive trees had been growing for 1,000 years. It was a small village, perhaps 300 souls, clustered around a church with a bell tower that could be seen from the valley below. The houses were made of stone, whitewashed against the summer heat, with red tile roofs that had been patched and repaired so many times that no 2 tiles were quite the same color. Capitolo 1, the village on the hill Maria Benedetto, had lived in this village all her life. She had been born in the same house where her mother had been born, and her grandmother before that, in a room with thick stone walls and a single window that looked out over the terraced hillside where the olive trees grew. She had been baptized in the village church, had made her first communion there, had attended the weddings and funerals of everyone she knew within its cool stone walls. She had never traveled more than 20 miles from the place of her birth. The village had a rhythm to it, a rhythm that had not changed in centuries. The church bells rang at dawn, calling the faithful to morning prayers. The men went out to the fields to tend the olive trees and the small plots of vegetables that grew in the terraces below the village. The women stayed home, cooking and cleaning and caring for the children, or went to the well in the village square to draw water and exchange gossip with their neighbors. In the evening, the bells rang again, and the families gathered for dinner, and the old men sat on the stone benches outside the church and smoked their pipes and talked about the weather and the crops and the news from the outside world that occasionally filtered into their quiet corner of creation. It was a hard life, but it was the only life Maria knew. The soil was poor, and the rains were unpredictable, and there were years when the olive harvest failed, and the whole village went hungry. But there were also years when the trees bore fruit in abundance, when the oil flowed golden and fragrant into the great clay jars, when there was enough to sell in the market town, and money to buy new clothes, and perhaps a ribbon for a daughter's hair. Maria's father had died when she was 12. He had been working in the olive grove when a branch broke beneath him and he fell, striking his head on a stone. He lived for 3 days after the fall, lying in the bed where Maria had been born, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow, while the village women came and went, and her mother sat beside him and prayed. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes and looked at Maria and said something she could not hear. And then he died, and the church bells rang, and they buried him in the cemetery on the hill above the village, where the wind blew through the cypress trees, and the view stretched all the way to the distant sea. After her father's death, Maria's mother had taken over the management of the family's small olive grove. It was unusual for a woman to do such work, but there was no choice. Maria's brother Giuseppe was only 15, too young to manage the grove alone, and there was no money to hire workers. So Maria's mother rose before dawn each day and walked down the terraced hillside to the grove, where she pruned and watered and harvested alongside her son, her hands growing rough and calloused, her back bending a little more each year under the weight of the work. Maria helped where she could. She learned to pick the olives when they were ripe, climbing the gnarled trees with a basket tied around her waist, her fingers stained purple with the juice of the fruit. She learned to press the olives in the great stone press that had belonged to her grandfather, turning the heavy wheel until the golden oil ran out into the catching basin below. She learned to mend the nets that were spread beneath the trees during harvest, to patch the baskets that were used to carry the fruit, to do all the small tasks that kept a family alive in a village where money was scarce and every hand was needed. But there was never enough. That was the truth that Maria came to understand as she grew older, the truth that lay beneath all the rhythms and routines of village life. There was never enough food, never enough money, never enough of anything to make life more than a daily struggle for survival. The olive trees gave what they gave, and it was not enough. The vegetable plots yielded what they yielded, and it was not enough. The market in the town paid what it paid for oil and vegetables, and it was not enough. And then the letters began to arrive from America. Giuseppe had left when Maria was 20. He had sold his share of the olive grove to a cousin, had packed his few belongings into a cloth bundle, and had walked to the train station in the valley below, where he had caught a train to Naples, and from Naples a ship to New York. The last time Maria had seen him, he had been standing on the platform of the train station, waving his hand as the train pulled away, growing smaller and smaller until he was just a speck in the distance, and then nothing at all. For 3 months after he left, there was no word. Maria's mother lit candles in the church every Sunday, praying for her son's safety, praying that he had survived the crossing, praying that he would write and tell them he was alive. And then, one day, a letter arrived. It was written on thin paper, in Giuseppe's careful handwriting, and it bore stamps that Maria had never seen before, stamps with pictures of strange buildings and unfamiliar faces. The letter said that Giuseppe had arrived safely in New York, that he had found work in a factory that made shirts, that he was living in a place called Brooklyn with other men from their region. The work was hard, he wrote, and the hours were long, and the city was strange and loud and overwhelming. But the wages were good, better than anything he could have earned in the village, better than anything he had imagined possible. More letters followed, one every few months, each one bringing news of Giuseppe's life in America. He had learned some English. He had moved to a better room. He had been promoted at the factory. He was saving money, sending some of it home to help the family, saving the rest for a future he was only beginning to imagine. The letters were full of details about American life, about the food and the weather and the strange customs of this new country. And they always ended the same way. Come, Giuseppe wrote. There is work here. There is a future here. Come. Maria read the letters over and over until she knew them by heart, until the words had worn themselves into her memory like water wearing grooves into stone. She thought about America constantly, dreamed about it at night, imagined what it would be like to walk the streets that Giuseppe described, to see the tall buildings and the electric lights and all the wonders of the new world. But dreaming was one thing. Going was another. The ticket cost $32. It might as well have cost $1,000. Maria's family had no money, no savings, nothing but the olive grove and the stone house and the small plot of vegetables that barely fed them through the year. $32 was a fortune, an impossibility, a sum so far beyond their reach that it seemed foolish even to think about it. But Maria thought about it anyway. She thought about it as she picked olives in the autumn, as she pressed them in the great stone press, as she carried the jars of oil to market and counted the coins that the merchant placed in her palm. She thought about it as she sat by the fire in winter, embroidering linens that she sold to the wealthy families in the town, her needle moving in and out of the fabric, each stitch bringing her a tiny fraction closer to the dream that burned inside her. It took her 2 years to save the money. 2 years of selling oil and vegetables, of embroidering linens and making lace, of doing laundry for the priest and mending clothes for the widow Calabrese, of taking every small job that came her way and saving every coin that passed through her fingers. 2 years of going without new clothes, without ribbons, without any of the small luxuries that made life bearable. 2 years of sacrifice and determination, of lying awake at night and counting the coins hidden beneath her mattress, watching the pile grow slowly, painfully slowly, toward the sum that would buy her passage to a new life. And finally, in the spring of 1892, she had enough. The morning of Maria's departure dawned gray and still. There had been rain in the night, a soft spring rain that had washed the dust from the olive leaves and left the air smelling of wet earth and new growth. Maria woke before the church bells rang, lying in the darkness of the room she had shared with her sisters since childhood, listening to their breathing, feeling the familiar roughness of the woolen blanket against her chin. She did not want to get up. She did not want to leave this bed, this room, this house where she had spent every day of her 23 years. She wanted to lie here forever, in the warmth and the darkness, pretending that this day was like any other day, that she would rise and eat her breakfast and go out to the olive grove and come home in the evening to her mother's cooking and her sister's chatter. She wanted to pretend that nothing was changing, that she was not about to leave everything she knew and everyone she loved and walk away into an unknown future. But she could not pretend. The day had come, and she had to face it. She rose quietly, so as not to wake her sisters, and dressed in the gray light that filtered through the single window. Her best dress was laid out on the chair beside the bed, the dark blue one she had made herself, with the white collar that her mother had embroidered with tiny flowers. She had been saving this dress for a special occasion, and she supposed that leaving your home forever qualified as special, even if it did not feel like a celebration. The dress was not new. Maria had made it 2 years ago, for the festival of San Rocco, and she had worn it only a handful of times since then, keeping it clean and pressed, saving it for important occasions. It was made of wool, dark blue, almost black, the color of the sky just before full darkness falls. The collar was white linen, embroidered by her mother with a pattern of tiny flowers, violets and forget-me-nots, worked in thread so fine that you had to look closely to see the stitches. Maria put on the dress slowly, carefully, feeling the familiar weight of the wool settle on her shoulders. She buttoned the buttons, 23 of them, each one made of bone and carved by her father years ago, before she was born. She smoothed the skirt with her hands, checking for wrinkles, for stains, for any imperfection that might make her look less than respectable. First impressions mattered, she knew. The way you looked when you arrived in America could determine how you were treated, could mean the difference between being admitted and being sent back. Her shoes were waiting by the door, the leather ones that pinched her feet, but that looked respectable. She had polished them the night before, working the cloth over the leather until it shone, until every scuff and scratch had been buffed away. The shoes were uncomfortable, too tight across the toes, but they were the only good shoes she owned, and she could not arrive in America wearing the wooden clogs she wore to work in the olive grove. The trunk was already packed. It sat by the door of the room, a wooden trunk that had belonged to her father before he died, reinforced with iron bands and fitted with a lock that no longer worked properly. Inside were her other dress, a plain gray one for everyday wear, her undergarments, carefully folded, a nightgown of white cotton, worn thin in places but still serviceable, a shawl of black wool for the cold nights on the ship, a small Bible that had been her grandmother's, the pages yellow with age, the leather cover soft from years of handling, a photograph of her family taken 2 years ago at the festival of San Rocco, showing her mother and her sisters and her brother Antonio standing stiffly in front of the church, their faces serious, their eyes squinting against the sun, and a cloth bag containing dried figs and hard biscuits for the journey. Her mother had packed this bag herself, choosing the best figs from the autumn harvest, baking the biscuits with her own hands, wrapping everything in cloth to keep it fresh. It was not much food for a journey of 2 weeks or more, but it was all they could spare, and Maria had tucked it carefully into a corner of the trunk, where it would be safe and dry. She looked at herself in the small mirror that hung on the wall, a mirror whose glass was old and spotted and showed her face as a blur of dark eyes and pale skin. She looked like a stranger, she thought, like someone she did not know, someone dressed for a journey she could not quite believe she was taking. The face in the mirror was the face of a woman who was about to leave everything behind, and it did not look afraid. It did not look sad. It looked, if anything, determined, ready. Her mother was waiting in the kitchen when Maria came down the stairs. She was standing by the fire, stirring something in a pot, and she did not turn around when Maria entered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft scrape of the spoon against the pot. "I made you breakfast," her mother said finally, still not turning around. "You should eat before you go. It will be a long day." Maria sat down at the table, the same table where she had eaten every meal of her life, where she had learned to read and write, where she had played games with her sisters and listened to her father tell stories on winter evenings. The wood was worn smooth by generations of hands, dark with age and use, carved with initials and marks that recorded the history of her family going back beyond memory. Her mother brought the pot to the table and ladled out a portion of polenta, thick and golden, steaming in the cool morning air. She added a drizzle of olive oil, oil from their own trees, pressed by their own hands, and a sprinkle of coarse salt. It was a simple meal, the same meal Maria had eaten 1,000 times before, but this morning it tasted different. This morning, every bite was a farewell. They ate in silence, mother and daughter, the words too heavy to speak. Maria's sisters came down one by one, Lucia and then Carmela, their eyes red from crying, their faces swollen with sleep and sorrow. They did not eat much. They sat at the table and watched Maria eat, and the watching was a kind of goodbye, a memorizing of the face and the hands and the way she held her spoon, storing up memories against the years of separation to come. Her brother, Antonio, arrived as Maria was finishing her breakfast. He had walked up from the valley where he lived now, with his wife and their new baby, walked through the darkness before dawn to say goodbye to his sister. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, filling it with his broad shoulders, and he did not say anything, just looked at Maria with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "I will carry your trunk," he said finally. "It is too heavy for you." Maria wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she could carry her own trunk, that she was strong enough, that she did not need help. But the words would not come, and she only nodded, and Antonio picked up the trunk as if it weighed nothing at all and carried it out into the gray morning light. The walk to the train station took an hour. They went down the terraced hillside, past the olive trees that Maria had tended since childhood, past the well where she had drawn water every day, past the stone walls that her grandfather had built and her father had repaired, and that would stand long after she was gone. The morning was cool and quiet, the sun just beginning to rise over the eastern hills, turning the sky from gray to pink to pale blue. Maria walked in the middle of the little procession, her mother on one side, her sisters on the other. Antonio walked ahead, carrying the trunk on his shoulder, and the village dogs followed them for a while, before losing interest and turning back. No one spoke. The only sounds were their footsteps on the dusty road and the distant bells of the church, ringing the hour, marking time as they had marked it for centuries. They passed other villagers on the road, people Maria had known all her life, people who had watched her grow from a child to a woman. Some of them called out greetings, wished her good luck, told her to write. Others simply nodded, their faces solemn, their eyes full of understanding. They knew what it meant to leave. Many of them had sons or brothers or husbands who had made the same journey, who had walked down the same road toward a future that was unknown and unknowable. The train station was in the valley, a small building of yellow stone with a red tile roof, surrounded by fields of wheat that were just beginning to turn green with the spring growth. There were others waiting on the platform when Maria arrived, other emigrants with their trunks and bundles, other families saying goodbye. She recognized some of them from the villages nearby, young men mostly, but also a few families with children, and one old woman who sat on her trunk and wept quietly into a handkerchief. They all had the same look about them, Maria noticed. A mixture of excitement and terror, of hope and grief. They were all leaving. They were all going to the same place. And yet each of them was utterly alone in their leaving. The train arrived with a great hissing of steam and a shriek of brakes. It was the largest machine Maria had ever seen, an iron beast that belched smoke and fire, that seemed to breathe and growl like a living thing. She had seen trains before, from a distance, had watched them pass through the valley below the village, but she had never been this close to one, had never felt the heat of its engine or the vibration of its wheels against the rails. Maria kissed her mother. The kiss was brief, a pressing of lips against a weathered cheek, but it contained everything Maria could not say, all the love and gratitude and sorrow that words were inadequate to express. Her mother's face was dry, her eyes clear. She had already cried all her tears in the privacy of the night, and now she stood straight and still, giving her daughter the gift of a calm farewell. She kissed her sisters, Lucia and Carmela, who were not so composed. They clung to her, their arms wrapped around her waist, their faces buried in her shoulder, their tears soaking through the wool of her dress. Maria held them and murmured comforts she did not believe, promises that she would write every week, that she would send for them as soon as she could, that they would all be together again some day in America. She did not know if any of these things would come true. She only knew that she had to say them, had to give her sisters something to hold on to in the years of separation to come. She embraced her brother Antonio, who had carried her trunk all the way from the village, and who now stood with tears running down his weathered cheeks, making no effort to wipe them away. Antonio was a man who rarely showed emotion, who had learned from their father to keep his feelings hidden behind a mask of stoic endurance. But now the mask was cracked, and Maria could see the love and fear and loss that lay beneath. Her mother pressed something into her hand, and Maria looked down to see a small medallion, a medallion of the Madonna that had hung above her parents' bed for as long as she could remember. The medallion was old, the silver tarnished, the image of the Virgin worn smooth by generations of fingers touching it in prayer. It was one of her mother's most precious possessions, one of the few things of value in their small stone house. "Be safe," her mother said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. Write to us. Do not forget us. I will write, Maria said. I will not forget. And then she climbed aboard the train and found a seat by the window and watched as her family grew smaller and smaller on the platform, waving their handkerchiefs, growing fainter and fainter until the train rounded a bend and they were gone. The train journey to Naples took most of the day. Maria sat by the window and watched the landscape change. The familiar hills of Calabria giving way to mountains and valleys she had never seen, to towns and villages whose names she did not know. The train stopped frequently at stations large and small, taking on passengers and cargo, letting others off. At each stop, Maria watched the people on the platforms, wondered where they were going, what stories they carried, what dreams or fears drove them to board this iron beast that carried them away from everything they knew. She did not speak to the other passengers. There were other emigrants in her car. She could tell by their bundles and their nervous eyes. But she did not know how to begin a conversation, did not know what to say to strangers who were embarking on the same journey. So she sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window, watching Italy roll past like a dream she was slowly waking from. The landscape grew more rugged as they traveled north, the gentle hills of Calabria rising into the steep mountains of the interior. Maria saw villages perched on cliff sides, ancient stone houses clinging to the rock as if they might tumble down at any moment. She saw rivers running through deep gorges, their waters gray with snowmelt from the peaks above. She saw forests of chestnut and oak, their new spring leaves bright green against the dark trunks. And she saw for the first time in her life the sea. It appeared suddenly as the train rounded a curve, a vast expanse of blue that stretched to the horizon and beyond. Maria pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass, her heart beating fast in her chest. She had heard of the sea, had seen pictures of it in books, had listened to the stories of fishermen who came to the village to sell their catch. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of it, for the sheer size and power of all that water, for the way it seemed to go on forever, merging with the sky at some invisible boundary that her eyes could not find. The train followed the coast for a while, and Maria watched the waves breaking against the rocky shore, watched the fishing boats bobbing in the harbors of small towns, watched the seabirds wheeling and diving above the water. She thought about the ocean she would soon cross, the Atlantic that lay between her and America, and she felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the train car. They arrived in Naples in the late afternoon, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western hills. The station was enormous, a cathedral of iron and glass that dwarfed anything Maria had ever seen. The noise was overwhelming, hundreds of people shouting and pushing and rushing in every direction. Porters with carts piled high with luggage. Vendors selling food and newspapers and tickets to every destination imaginable. Maria stood on the platform with her trunk at her feet and felt, for the first time since leaving her village, truly and completely lost. Naples was like nothing Maria had ever experienced. The streets were narrow and winding, paved with stones that were slick with rain and garbage and things she did not want to think about. The buildings rose up on either side, 4 and 5 stories tall, their balconies draped with laundry, their windows open to the sounds and smells of the city. People were everywhere, shouting in dialects she could barely understand, selling things from carts and baskets and the mouths of alleyways, begging, arguing, laughing, living their lives at a volume and intensity that made Maria's village seem like a place of perfect silence. The smell was different too. In her village, the air smelled of olive trees and wood smoke and the clean dust of the hillsides. Here, it smelled of fish and garbage, of sewage and coal smoke, of too many people living too close together. Maria breathed through her mouth and tried not to look too closely at the gutters, where things floated that she did not want to identify. Capital 02. The journey to the sea, she followed the other immigrants through the streets. A straggling procession of the displaced and the hopeful, all of them heading toward the emigration offices near the harbor. They walked in a group, staying close together for safety, their trunks carried by porters who demanded payment in coins and curses. Maria had been warned about the porters of Naples, warned that they would cheat her if they could, would charge 10 times what the service was worth. So she carried her own trunk, though her arms ached and her back screamed, and her feet blistered inside her too tight shoes. The emigration offices were housed in a long, low building near the waterfront, a building of gray stone that looked like it had been built to process cattle rather than human beings. There were lines everywhere, lines of people waiting to show their tickets, waiting to answer questions, waiting to submit to the medical examinations that would determine whether they were fit to travel. Maria took her place at the end of one of these lines and began to wait. The waiting took hours. The line moved slowly, painfully slowly, shuffling forward a few feet at a time, then stopping for long periods while nothing seemed to happen at all. Maria's trunk grew heavier with each passing minute. Her feet throbbed inside her shoes. Her stomach growled with hunger, but she did not dare leave the line to find food, afraid that she would lose her place, afraid that she would miss her chance to board the ship that would carry her to America. Around her, the other emigrants waited with the same patient resignation. They were people from all over southern Italy. Maria could tell from their accents and their faces, from the villages of Calabria and Sicily and Campania and Puglia. Some of them were traveling alone, like Maria. Others were in groups, families with children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters. They spoke to each other in low voices, sharing stories, sharing fears, sharing the small scraps of information they had gathered about the journey ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the front of the line. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged man with a bald head and tired eyes. He looked at Maria without interest, without curiosity, as though she were not a person, but a piece of cargo to be processed and shipped. He asked for her ticket, her papers, her identification. Maria handed them over with trembling fingers, afraid that something would be wrong, that there would be some problem she had not anticipated, that she would be turned away at the last moment. But there was no problem. The clerk looked at her papers, made some marks in a ledger, and told her to proceed to the medical examination room. The medical examination was brief and humiliating. Maria was directed into a large room where doctors in white coats examined the immigrants one by one, checking their eyes, their teeth, their scalps, looking for signs of disease or disability that would make them unsuitable for travel. She was made to strip to her undergarments in a room full of strangers, to stand while a doctor looked at her body with the same disinterest the clerk had shown to her papers. He poked and prodded, listened to her breathing, looked into her eyes with a bright light that made her blink and tear up. And then he made a mark on a card and waved her through to the next room. She had passed. She was fit to travel. And in the next room, another clerk handed her a tag to tie around her neck, a tag with a number on it that identified her as a passenger on the ship Julia, departing for New York the following morning. Maria spent that night in a boarding house near the harbor, a cramped room she shared with 5 other women, all of them emigrants, all of them too nervous to sleep. The room was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of mildew and cooking oil, and the only window looked out onto a narrow alleyway where cats fought and screamed through the night. The bed was narrow and hard, the mattress filled with straw that poked through the thin fabric and scratched at Maria's skin. But it was a bed, and it was indoors, and it was better than sleeping in the streets. The other women in the room talked late into the night, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes for the journey ahead. There was a young woman from Sicily who was going to join her fiancé in a place called Chicago. There was a mother with 2 small children whose husband had been in America for 5 years and was finally sending for his family. There was an old woman, older than Maria's mother, who was going to live with her son in a city she could not pronounce. Maria listened to their stories and told her own, and the telling helped to pass the time, helped to quiet the fear that churned in her stomach like the sea she would soon cross. She talked about her village, about her brother Giuseppe, about the letters that had arrived over the past 3 years, each one painting a picture of America that was both wondrous and terrifying. The other women nodded and murmured and shared their own letters, their own pictures, their own uncertain dreams. They did not sleep much that night. They lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the city outside, the distant crash of waves against the seawall, the shouts of drunken sailors, the barking of dogs. And they thought about what the morning would bring. By the 3rd day, a routine had established itself. The kind of routine that forms when there is nothing else to hold on to, when the hours must be divided and marked somehow, or they will simply blur together into an endless gray monotony. The bell rang at 6 o'clock, signaling that it was time to rise, to fold the blankets, to make what order could be made out of the chaos of the steerage compartment. Women who were well enough climbed down from their bunks and began the slow process of dressing, washing, preparing for another day in this floating world. The 6 o'clock bell became the anchor of Maria's existence. She would lie in her bunk in the darkness before dawn, feeling the ship roll beneath her, listening to the breathing of the women around her, and she would wait for that bell. It was the signal that the night was over, that another day had begun, that she was one day closer to America. The sound of it, clear and bright in the heavy air of the compartment, was like a small gift, a reminder that time was still passing, that she was still moving forward. Washing was difficult. There were only 2 basins of fresh water for the entire women's compartment, 2 small metal basins that sat on a table near the stairs, and they had to be shared among 200 people. Maria learned to wake early, to be among the first to reach the basins, to splash a little water on her face and hands before the water turned gray with the grime of dozens of bodies. The water was cold, always cold, and it smelled faintly of metal and something else, something she could not identify, but that was definitely not the clean smell of the well in her village. There was no privacy. Women washed and dressed in full view of each other, modesty abandoned out of necessity, out of the simple impossibility of finding a private space in a room so crowded. Maria had grown up in a house with 4 women, had shared beds and baths with her sisters all her life, but this was different. These were strangers, women from villages she had never heard of, speaking dialects she could barely understand, and yet here they were, washing their faces and changing their clothes and attending to their most intimate needs in a space where everyone could see. She learned not to look. She learned to focus on her own washing, her own dressing, her own small corner of the bunk where she could sit and braid her hair and pretend that she was alone. She learned that the other women were doing the same thing, that everyone had agreed, without speaking, to pretend that they could not see each other, to grant each other the illusion of privacy, even though the reality was that there was none. The toilets were worse. The 2 wooden seats behind the thin curtain were in constant use, and the line to reach them stretched down the aisle between the bunks, a line of women with desperate expressions, shifting from foot to foot, trying to hold on until their turn came. The curtain was thin enough that everything could be heard, every sound amplified in the close air of the compartment, and the smell that came from behind it was overwhelming. A reek of human waste and seawater that mingled with all the other smells and created an atmosphere that was almost unbearable. There was no paper. There had been paper at the beginning, a small supply that the ship's crew had provided, but it had run out by the 2nd day, and now there was only newspaper, scraps of Italian and German newspapers that some of the more experienced emigrants had thought to bring with them. Maria used the newspaper carefully, rationing it, knowing that it would not last the entire journey, trying not to think about what she would use when it was gone. The toilets emptied directly into the sea. Maria could hear the sound of the water beneath them, could feel the cold air rising up through the wooden seats, could see, if she looked down, the gray-green churn of the ocean below. It was terrifying, the first time, to sit suspended above all that water, to know that there was nothing between her and the sea but a few feet of air and the creaking timbers of the ship. But she got used to it. She got used to everything. The body, she learned, could adapt to almost anything if it had no other choice. Maria learned to breathe through her mouth. She learned to focus on small things, on the texture of the blanket beneath her fingers, on the sound of Rose's voice as she told stories to her children, on the gray light that filtered through the portholes and marked the passing of the hours. She learned to not think about the air she was breathing, the food she was eating, the water she was drinking. She learned to endure. Breakfast was served at 7 o'clock, an hour after the wake-up bell, an hour that seemed much longer when there was nothing to do but wait. The food was prepared in the small galley at the end of the compartment, a cramped space where 2 women from the ship's crew worked over a coal-burning stove, stirring enormous pots of porridge and boiling water for coffee. The smell of the cooking drifted through the compartment, mixing with all the other smells, and Maria's stomach would growl with hunger, even though she was not sure she wanted to eat what was coming. The morning meal was always the same: a thin porridge made from oatmeal and water, ladled into tin bowls that the passengers had brought with them. A piece of hard bread, the same kind of bread that sailors had been eating for centuries, baked until it was hard as stone, impossible to chew unless you soaked it in the porridge or the coffee. And a cup of black coffee that was more water than coffee, weak and bitter and barely warm by the time it reached the bunks at the far end of the compartment. Maria ate her porridge slowly, sitting on the edge of her bunk with her bowl balanced on her knees. The taste was bland, almost non-existent, just oats and water with no salt, no sugar, no flavor of any kind. But the warmth was welcome in the chill of the steerage compartment, and she ate every bite, scraping the bowl with her spoon, soaking the hard bread until it was soft enough to swallow. The bread was difficult to eat. It was so hard that it made her jaw ache, so dry that it seemed to absorb all the moisture in her mouth and leave her throat feeling like sandpaper. She learned to break off small pieces and let them soften in the porridge, or to dip them in the coffee and hold them there until they were pliable enough to chew. The other women did the same thing, and the sound of bread being dunked and softened filled the breakfast hour, a rhythmic splashing that became as familiar as the roll of the ship. The ship's engines generated heat, but it did not reach this far down. The steerage compartment was in the lowest part of the ship, below the waterline, and the iron hull that separated them from the sea was always cold, radiating a chill that seeped into everything. The air was cold and damp. The blankets were always slightly wet, and Maria's fingers were always slightly numb. She learned to keep moving, to flex her hands and feet, to rub her arms and legs to keep the blood flowing. She learned to sleep with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her grandmother's shawl, the wool still soft despite its age. After breakfast, there was nothing to do but wait. The steerage passengers were not allowed on the upper decks, where the first and second class passengers walked and breathed fresh air and looked at the sea. There was a rope strung across the bottom of the stairs and a sign in several languages. That said passengers not permitted beyond this point, and a crew member who sat by the rope to make sure that no one crossed it. The first and second class passengers paid more for their tickets, and one of the things they paid for was the privilege of not having to see or smell the people in steerage. The steerage passengers were confined to their compartment, to the narrow aisles between the bunks, to the small area around the tables and benches where they could sit if they were lucky enough to find a space. There was not enough room for everyone to sit at once. There was barely enough room for everyone to stand at once. And so they took turns, rotating through the few chairs and benches, standing in the aisles or lying in their bunks when the seats were full. Some women brought handwork with them, embroidery or knitting or mending, and they sat in the dim light and worked their needles and tried to keep their minds occupied. The click of knitting needles became one of the constant sounds of the compartment, a rhythmic clicking that mixed with the throb of the engines and the creak of the ship and the murmur of voices. Maria watched the women knit and wished she had brought something to work on. She had not thought about how long the days would be, how slowly the hours would pass when there was nothing to do but sit and wait and think. She lay in her bunk and watched the shadows move on the ceiling, the play of light from the oil lamps that swung with the motion of the ship. The shadows formed patterns that she tried to make sense of, faces and animals and landscapes that appeared and disappeared as the lamps moved. She named them, gave them stories, imagined whole worlds in the shifting darkness above her head. It was a childish game, but it helped to pass the time, helped to keep her mind from dwelling on the things she was trying not to think about. She sat at one of the tables and listened to the other women talk. They talked about their villages, their families, the men who were waiting for them in America. They talked about the food they missed, the beds they missed, the familiar sounds and smells of home. They talked about America, about the streets paved with gold, about the opportunities that awaited anyone willing to work, about the new life that was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. Some of the stories were hopeful, full of dreams and plans and eager anticipation. Others were darker, full of fears and doubts and the knowledge that America might not be everything they hoped for. She stood by one of the portholes and tried to see the ocean through the small, dirty glass. The portholes were perhaps 8 inches in diameter, set into the iron hull at intervals along the compartment. They were covered with a thick layer of salt and grime that obscured the view. But if Maria pressed her face close to the glass and cupped her hands around her eyes, she could see something of the world outside. Gray water, mostly, an endless expanse of gray water that rose and fell with the motion of the ship. Sometimes there were waves, whitecaps that formed and dissolved and formed again. Sometimes there were clouds, gray masses that seemed to merge with the gray of the sea until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The ocean was enormous. That was the thing that struck her most when she could see it. It stretched in every direction, gray and endless, without any sign of land or life. The ship seemed so small against all that water, a tiny speck of iron and wood crossing an emptiness that defied comprehension. Maria thought about all the water beneath them, all the dark fathoms where the sunlight never reached, where creatures lived that had never seen a human being. She thought about what would happen if the ship sank, if all these hundreds of people were thrown into that gray water with nothing to hold on to. And then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it made the fear too real. The midday meal was served at noon. It was usually soup, a thin broth with pieces of potato or turnip floating in it, the vegetables boiled until they were. Soft and colorless, their flavor leached out into the water. The soup was served in the same tin bowls that had held the morning porridge, and it was accompanied by more of the hard bread that seemed to be the staple of every meal. Sometimes there was meat in the soup, small pieces of something that might have been beef or might have been something else, boiled until it was gray and stringy and almost impossible to chew. The meat had no flavor, or rather, it had a flavor that was not quite right, a taste that suggested it might have been old or improperly stored before it was cooked. Maria ate it anyway. She ate everything she was given, because she was always hungry, because the food she had brought from home was running out, because there was nothing else. The portions were never enough. A bowl of thin soup and a piece of hard bread did not satisfy the hunger that gnawed at everyone's stomachs, that kept them awake at night, that made them irritable and weak. Maria learned to eat slowly, to chew, each bite many times, to make the food last as long as possible, so that she could pretend she was eating more than she actually was. She learned to drink a lot of water before meals, to fill her stomach with liquid so that there would be less room for the hunger to occupy. After the midday meal, the afternoon stretched ahead, another 6 or 7 hours of waiting and watching, and trying not to think about how many days remained. Some women slept, retreating to their bunks and closing their eyes and escaping into dreams that were hopefully better than the reality they were living. Some women talked, gathering in small groups around the tables, sharing stories and gossip and the latest rumors about when the ship would arrive. Some women prayed. The rosaries came out in the afternoon, wooden beads and silver beads and beads made of seeds strung on thread, clicking through work-worn fingers as lips moved in silent petition. Maria joined them sometimes, taking out her Mother's medallion and holding it as she recited the Hail Mary over and over until the words lost their meaning and became just sounds, just rhythm, just something to fill the silence inside her head. The evening meal was served at 6 o'clock. It was usually the same as the midday meal, soup and bread, though sometimes there was a piece of fish instead of meat, or a spoonful of rice that had been boiled until it was sticky and flavorless. The fish was always salted, preserved in barrels in the ship's hold, and it had a sharp, briny taste that made Maria thirsty for hours afterward. After dinner, the oil lamps were extinguished at 9 o'clock, and the compartment was plunged into darkness. The darkness was not complete. A single lamp was left burning at a very low flame near the stairs, so that anyone who needed to use the toilets in the night could find their way. But the rest of the compartment was dark, and in that darkness, the sounds seemed louder, the smells seemed stronger, and the fears that Maria kept at bay during the day came crowding in from all sides. She lay in her bunk and listened to the breathing of the women around her. 200 women and children, breathing in and out, a constant rhythm that mixed with the throb of the engines and the creak of the ship and the distant sound of the sea against the hull. Some of the breathing was regular and deep, the breathing of those who had managed to find sleep. Some of it was shallow and troubled, the breathing of those who were sick or afraid, or lying awake in the darkness, thinking about the homes they had left behind. The nights were the longest part of the journey. The days, for all their tedium, at least had structure. The bells that marked the hours, the meals that divided the time, the small activities that filled the spaces between. But the nights were formless, shapeless, 9 hours of darkness that stretched on until the 6 o'clock bell finally rang and another day began. Maria thought about her family in those dark hours. She thought about her mother, alone now in the house that had once held 5 people, cooking meals for one, sleeping in the bed that she had shared with Maria's father for 30 years. She thought about her sisters, going about their daily routines, walking the same roads that Maria had walked, seeing the same olive trees that Maria had seen, living the same life that Maria had escaped. She wondered if they missed her. She wondered if they talked about her in the evenings, wondering where she was, wondering if she was safe. She thought about Giuseppe, waiting for her in Brooklyn, and she tried to imagine what his life was like, what her life would be like when she arrived. She had never seen a city like New York. She had never seen a building taller than the church tower in her village. She had never met an American, had never heard the English language spoken, except in the few words that Giuseppe had included in his letters. What would it be like to live in a place where she could not understand what people were saying, where every sign and every newspaper and every conversation was in a language she did not know? The questions circled through her mind like birds, never landing, never settling, just circling and circling in the darkness. And then, eventually, exhaustion would claim her, and she would fall into a sleep that was not quite rest, that was filled with dreams of water and distance and the sound of her mother's voice calling her name. The storm came on the 5th night. Maria was lying in her bunk, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when she felt the ship begin to move in a way it had not moved before. The rolling became more pronounced, more violent, the bow lifting and then dropping with a force that made the timbers creak and the oil lamps swing in wide arcs on their chains. She sat up, clutching the edge of her bunk, and looked around at the other women. In the dim light of the single lamp, she could see their faces, pale and frightened, their eyes wide, their mouths open. The ship tilted sharply to one side, and several women screamed, and somewhere a trunk that had not been properly secured went sliding across the floor with a crash that echoed through the compartment. The wind hit the ship like a fist. Maria could hear it screaming in the rigging above, a sound like nothing she had ever heard, like the voice of some enormous beast that had been awakened from sleep and was now raging against the world. The howling was constant, relentless, a wall of sound that seemed to press against the iron hull of the ship and threaten to push it over. The waves began to crash against the hull, each impact sending a shudder through the vessel, each impact followed by the groan of metal under stress. Maria could feel the ship twisting, flexing, responding to forces that seemed too great for any human creation to withstand. The groaning of the metal was like the groaning of a living thing, like the ship itself was in pain, was crying out against the violence of the sea. Someone was screaming. Maria could not tell who it was, could not see anything in the darkness that had descended when the storm knocked out the remaining lamp. The compartment was pitch black now, and the only way to know where anything was by sound and by touch. She held onto her bunk with both hands, her knuckles white, her fingers aching from the effort, and she felt the world tilt and spin around her. The children were crying. All of them, it seemed, their voices rising in a chorus of terror that was almost worse than the sound of the wind. Rose's children were somewhere nearby. Maria could hear them, their small voices calling for their mother. And Rosa was trying to answer them, trying to reach them. But the ship was pitching so violently that she could not move without falling. Water began to come in. Maria felt it first as drops on her face, spray that had found its way through the portholes, through Capital 03, the storm that cracks in the deck above, through whatever openings the sea could find. The water was cold, shockingly cold, and it smelled of salt and something else, something ancient and inhuman, the smell of the deep ocean that had never seen the light of the sun. Then the drops became a trickle, then a stream, cold salt water running down the walls and pooling on the floor, mixing with the vomit and the straw and everything else that covered the planks. Maria could hear it splashing, could feel it soaking through her blanket, could taste the salt on her lips when she licked them. The water was rising. The water was coming in, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The storm lasted for hours. Maria lost all sense of time, lost all sense of anything except the motion and the noise, and the cold water that soaked through her clothes and her blanket and chilled her to the bone. She prayed, the words of the Hail Mary coming automatically to her lips, but the words seemed inadequate, seemed to disappear into the howling of the wind before they could reach whatever ears might be listening. She thought about her mother, and she was glad that her mother could not see this, could not know what was happening. She thought about her village, about the olive trees that would be blooming now in the spring warmth, about the road that led to the train station, about all the familiar things that she might never see again. She thought about dying, about what it would be like to feel the water close over her head, to sink into the darkness beneath the waves, to join all the others who had died on this crossing, all the emigrants whose bones lay scattered on the floor of the Atlantic. And she thought about her brother Giuseppe, waiting for her in Brooklyn, not knowing that she was in the middle of a storm, not knowing that she might never arrive. What would he do when the ship did not come? Would he go to the harbor every day, waiting, hoping, until finally someone told him that the Julia had been lost at sea with all hands. Would he write to their mother? Would he try to find the words to tell her that the daughter she had sent to America would never arrive? The questions were too terrible to think about, and so Maria stopped thinking, stopped trying to make sense of anything, and simply held on. She held on to her bunk, and she held on to her mother's medallion, and she held on to the hope that somehow, the ship would survive this storm and carry her through to the other side. And then, gradually, the storm began to subside. The rolling became less violent. The wind dropped from a howl to a moan to a whisper. The water stopped coming in, and the sounds of the ship changed from the groaning of metal under stress to the steady throb of the engines pushing forward. Maria lay in her bunk, soaked and shivering, and listened to the quieting of the storm, and felt a gratitude so intense that it was almost painful. The dawn came eventually, a pale gray light that filtered through the portholes and revealed the damage that the night had wrought. Several trunks had broken loose and smashed against the walls, spilling their contents across the floor. Clothing and photographs and precious mementos lay scattered in the water that still pooled on the planks. One woman had broken her arm when she fell from her bunk, and she sat now on one of the benches, cradling her arm, her face gray with pain. Another woman had hit her head and was bleeding from a cut above her eye, the blood running down her face and dripping onto her dress. The floor was ankle-deep in water and debris. Straw from the mattresses floated on the surface, along with bits of food and personal belongings and things that Maria did not want to look at too closely. The air smelled of vomit and seawater and fear, a compound smell that was worse than anything the compartment had produced before. But they were alive. All of them. Even the children, even the elderly woman who had not moved from her bunk since they left Naples. They were alive, and the ship was still moving, and somewhere ahead, beyond the gray horizon, America was waiting. The days that followed the storm were different from the days that had come before. The weather turned calm, almost unnaturally calm, as though the sea was exhausted from its violence and needed to rest. The surface of the water was smooth, almost glassy, reflecting the gray sky above like a mirror. The motion of the ship settled into a gentle rocking that was almost soothing after the terror of the storm, a rhythm that lulled the body and calmed the mind. The women emerged from their bunks and began the work of cleaning up. They wrung out blankets and hung them on lines strung between the bunks, hoping that the damp air would dry them eventually. They mopped the water from the floor with rags and buckets, working in teams, passing the full buckets to the toilets where they were emptied into the sea. They sorted through the debris, salvaging what could be salvaged, discarding what was ruined beyond repair, that Maria helped where she could. She had no special skills, no experience with anything except the life of her village, but she had strong arms and a willingness to work. She carried buckets of dirty water to the toilets and emptied them, making trip after trip until her arms ached and her back was sore. She helped Rosa wring out the blankets that had been soaked by the spray, twisting the heavy wool until the water ran out in streams. She sat with the woman who had broken her arm and held her hand while one of the crew members fashioned a splint from pieces of wood. The work was hard, but it was good to have something to do, something to occupy the hands and the mind, something to focus on other than the fear and the uncertainty. The women worked together without speaking much. A silent cooperation that transcended the barriers of language and dialect. A shared understanding that they were all in this together, that they would survive or fail together. Rose's children helped too, in their small ways. Paolo, the 7-year-old, carried armloads of wet straw to the galley, where it was thrown into the stove to dry. Lucia, the 4-year-old, collected the scattered belongings and tried to return them to their owners, toddling through the compartment with her arms full of socks and handkerchiefs and small treasures that had been scattered by the storm. The children's presence was a comfort somehow, a reminder that life continued, that the future was not just a dream, but a real thing that would arrive eventually. By the afternoon of the 6th day, the compartment was more or less restored to its previous state. The floor was as clean as it was going to get. The blankets were hung to dry. The broken trunks had been repaired with rope and bits of wood. The woman with the broken arm had been given laudanum from the ship's medicine chest and was sleeping fitfully in her bunk. The world had not ended. The journey was continuing. And somewhere ahead, growing closer with each passing hour, was the land they had all come so far to see. The routine resumed. The bells rang at their appointed hours. The meals were served. The days passed in their slow, heavy rhythm, each one the same as the one before, each one bringing them closer to America. Maria lay in her bunk and watched the shadows move on the ceiling. She sat at the tables and listened to the other women talk. She stood by the portholes and watched the endless gray water scroll past. She ate the thin soup and the hard bread. She prayed. She waited. She endured. The sounds of the crossing, the sounds of the steerage compartment became as familiar to Maria as the sounds of her own heartbeat. There was the constant throb of the engines, a deep, rhythmic pulse that never stopped, day or night, that vibrated through the iron walls and the wooden bunks and the bodies of everyone aboard. It was the heartbeat of the ship, the mechanical pulse that drove them westward across the Atlantic. And Maria came to depend on it, to find comfort in its regularity, to feel anxious on the capital of 4 rare occasions when it faltered or changed. There was the creaking of the timbers, the groaning of metal under stress, the sounds of a great machine straining against the forces of wind and water. These sounds were louder during storms, of course, when the ship rolled and pitched and the whole structure seemed to cry out in protest. But they were always there, even on calm days, a constant reminder that they were suspended above an ocean that could swallow them at any moment, that their survival depended on the skill of the builders and the strength of the materials and 1,000 other factors beyond their control. There was the sound of the water itself, the hiss and splash of waves against the hull, the distant roar of the sea that filtered down through the decks and the walls and filled the compartment with a kind of ambient noise, a white sound that was always present, always surrounding them. Maria learned to distinguish between the sounds of calm water and rough water, between the gentle lap of waves on a peaceful day and the angry crash of swells during a storm. She learned to read the sea by its sounds, to know what kind of weather awaited them on deck before she climbed the stairs to see it. There was the sound of the bell, that brass instrument that ruled their days, that called them to meals and to sleep, and to the brief periods of exercise on deck. The bell rang at 6 in the morning to wake them, at 7 for breakfast, at noon for dinner, at 6 for supper, at 9 for lights out. It divided the endless hours into manageable segments, gave structure to days that would otherwise have been formless and unbearable. Maria came to listen for the bell, to anticipate its ringing, to feel a small surge of relief each time it sounded, because each bell brought them a little closer to the end of the journey. And there were the sounds of the people, the hundreds of women and children packed into the compartment, each one making their own noises, their own contributions to the symphony of steerage. There was the crying of babies, thin and reedy, demanding attention that their exhausted mothers could barely provide. There was the coughing of the sick, the dry, hacking sounds that made everyone worry about contagion, about disease spreading through the close quarters. There was the murmur of prayers, the clicking of rosary beads, the whispered words of women seeking comfort in their faith. There was the chatter of children, the scolding of mothers, the quiet conversations of women who were trying to pass the time by sharing stories and gossip and memories of home. At night, the sounds changed. The crying of babies gave way to the softer sounds of sleep, the breathing and sighing and occasional snoring of 200 souls. The conversations faded into silence, broken only by the whispered prayers of those who could not sleep, the moaning of those who were sick, the weeping of those who were homesick. The darkness was not silent, never silent, but it had its own quality, its own texture, different from the sounds of day. Maria lay in her bunk and listened to all of it. Let the sounds wash over her. Let them become the soundtrack of her journey. She knew that she would remember these sounds for the rest of her life, that they would come back to her in quiet moments, in the silence of a sleepless night, in the spaces between other sounds. They were the sounds of her crossing, the sounds of her transformation from one life to another, and they would stay with her always. The food in steerage was memorable for all the wrong reasons. Maria would remember it for the rest of her life, not with fondness, but with a kind of grim acceptance, the way one remembers a necessary hardship that had to be endured. Breakfast was the same every morning, a thin porridge made from oatmeal and water, sweetened with nothing, flavored with nothing but a faint taste of salt that might have come from the water or might have come from the sweat of the cooks. The porridge was served lukewarm, in tin bowls that had been used by countless emigrants before, bowls that were never quite clean no matter how many times they were washed. Maria ate it with a wooden spoon that she had brought from home, one of the few utensils she owned, scraping the bowl clean even when her stomach rebelled against the texture and the taste. The bread was hard, a dark loaf that grew harder with each passing day, until by the end of the journey, it was more like a rock than anything edible. Maria learned to soak it in her porridge, to soften it, to gnaw at it slowly with her back teeth, to extract whatever nutrition it might contain through sheer determination. The bread was supposed to last the entire journey, and it did, because no one ate more of it than they had to. The midday meal and the evening meal were the same. A thin soup with pieces of potato or turnip or sometimes, rarely, a fragment of meat that might have been beef or might have been something else entirely. The soup was served from large cauldrons that were carried down from the galley, ladled into bowls by crew members who did not care whether the portions were equal, who did not care whether the pieces of vegetable were distributed fairly. Some women got more, some got less, and there was no point in complaining. Maria learned to eat slowly, to make each meal last as long as possible, to extract the maximum amount of satisfaction from the minimum amount of food. She learned to chew each piece of potato carefully, to swirl the broth around in her mouth before swallowing, to pretend that she was eating something better, something more substantial, something that would actually fill her stomach instead of leaving her hungry an hour later. The water was almost as bad as the food. It came from tanks in the hold of the ship, tanks that had been filled in Naples and that grew more brackish with each passing day. By the middle of the journey, the water tasted of rust and mold and something organic that Maria did not want to think about. She drank it anyway, because she had to, because there was no other option. Because dehydration was worse than whatever diseases might be lurking in the water dot. And then there was the food she had brought from home. The dried figs and hard biscuits that her mother had packed with such care. That represented the last taste of her village, the last connection to the place she had left behind. Maria rationed these treasures carefully, eating only a little each day, saving them for moments when the hunger became unbearable, when she needed something to remind her of who she was and where she had come from. The figs were the best, dark and sweet and chewy, with a flavor that transported her back to the hills of Calabria, to the autumn days when she had helped her mother harvest them, spread them on racks to dry in the sun, pack them away for the winter months. Each fig was a memory, a connection to a past that was receding further with each passing day. She savored them slowly, letting the sweetness dissolve on her tongue, closing her eyes and imagining she was home. By the 8th day, the figs were gone. By the 10th day, the biscuits were crumbs. And Maria was left with nothing but the thin soup and the hard bread, and the hunger that never quite went away. The physical sensations of the crossing were as varied as they were constant. Maria felt them in her body, in her muscles and her skin and her bones, and they became part of her in ways that she would never entirely escape. There was the motion of the ship, the endless rolling and pitching that never stopped, that made everything uncertain. That turned the simple act of walking from bunk to basin into a test of balance and coordination. Maria learned to move with the ship, to anticipate its movements, to plant her feet wide and bend her knees and let her body sway with the rhythm of the sea. It was like learning to dance, she thought, except the dance never ended, and the floor was always trying to throw you off. There was the cold. The steerage compartment was deep in the belly of the ship, far from any source of heat, and the walls were iron, cold iron that sucked the warmth from the air and from the bodies of everyone inside. Maria's blanket was never quite warm enough, never quite dry, and she spent many nights curled into a ball, her knees pulled to her chest, her hands tucked into her armpits, trying to conserve whatever heat her body could generate. There was the damp, the moisture from the sea, from the breath of 200 people, from the water that leaked in through cracks and seams, seemed to permeate everything. The blankets were damp. The clothes were damp. The air itself was damp, heavy with humidity, thick with the moisture of too many bodies in too small a space. Maria could feel the dampness on her skin, in her hair, in her lungs with every breath she took. There was the roughness of the blanket against her skin, the scratchy wool that had been used by countless emigrants before her, that had absorbed their sweat and their tears and their suffering. The mattress beneath her was little more than a sack of straw, thin and lumpy, offering no cushion against the hard wooden boards of the bunk. She woke every morning with aches in her shoulders and her hips, with a stiffness in her back that took hours to work out. There was the press of bodies, the closeness of too many people in too small a space. Maria could reach out and touch the bunk above her, could feel the presence of the woman who slept there, could hear her breathing and her turning and her restless movements through the night. She could feel the presence of Rosa beside her, of Concetta below her, of all the women who surrounded her in this floating community of strangers. And there was hunger, the constant, gnawing hunger that was never quite satisfied, that woke her in the morning and kept her company through the day and followed her into her dreams at night. Her stomach seemed to have shrunk during the crossing, accustomed now to small portions, to the thin soup and the hard bread that were never enough. But the hunger was still there, a physical presence, a reminder of all the things she had given up, of all the comforts she had left behind. These sensations became normal, became part of Maria's daily existence, became so familiar that she almost forgot what it felt like to be warm, to be dry, to be full. And when she finally stepped off the barge at Ellis Island and felt solid ground beneath her feet, felt the warmth of the spring sun on her face, felt the space in the air and the freedom of being outside the steerage compartment, the contrast was so overwhelming that she nearly wept that Maria dreamed every night on the ship, vivid dreams that stayed with her long after she woke, that seemed more real than the waking world of the steerage compartment. She dreamed of home. She dreamed of the village, of the stone house where she had been born, of the olive trees on the terraced hillside. She dreamed of her mother, standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot of polenta, her face turned away so that Maria could not see her expression. She dreamed of her sisters, laughing and running through the narrow streets, their hair streaming behind them, their voices carrying on the wind. She dreamed of the church, of the bell tower, of the sound of the bells calling her to prayer. These dreams were comforting, in a way. They allowed her to return to the places and the people she had left behind, to visit them, even as the ship carried her further and further away. But they were also painful, because when she woke, the loss was fresh all over again. The realization that she was not there, would never be there again, was like a knife in her heart. She dreamed of Giuseppe. She dreamed of him as she remembered him, the young man who had left the village 3 years ago, thin and dark-haired, with their mother's eyes and their father's jaw. She dreamed of him waiting for her on a pier, waving his hand, his face split by a smile. She dreamed of embracing him, of holding him, of finally being reunited after so long apart. She dreamed of America. She dreamed of streets paved with gold, of buildings that touched the sky, of shops filled with food and clothes, and all the things she had never been able to afford. She dreamed of the Statue of Liberty, though she had never seen it, a green goddess rising from the water, welcoming her to a new life. She dreamed of the future, of children and grandchildren, of a life that was easier than the one she had known. And she dreamed of the ship. She dreamed of the steerage compartment, of the bunks and the basins, and the thin soup and the hard bread. She dreamed of Rosa and her children, of Concetta and her stories of midwifery, of the young woman who cried every night. She dreamed of the storm, of the water pouring in, of the screaming and the praying and the terror of knowing that she might die. These dreams blurred together, sometimes creating strange combinations of home and ship, of past and present, of hope and fear. Maria woke from them disoriented, uncertain for a moment where she was, whether she was in her bed in the village or on her bunk in the steerage compartment or somewhere else entirely, some place that existed only in her sleeping mind. But always, always, she woke to the same reality, the throb of the engines, the roll of the ship, the smell of bodies and vomit and the sea, the knowledge that she was somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither, waiting to arrive at a destination that was still beyond the horizon, the weight of leaving never fully lifted during the crossing. Maria carried it with her everywhere, a heaviness in her chest that would not go away, a sorrow that was always there, beneath the fear and the hunger and the physical discomfort. She had left everything, everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved. Her mother, who had held her when she was born, who had taught her to pray and to cook and to embroider, who had pressed the Madonna medallion into her hand on the morning of her departure. Her sisters, who had been her companions through childhood, who had shared her bed and her secrets and her dreams. Her brother Antonio, who had carried her trunk to the train station, who had wept openly as he said goodbye. Her village, with its narrow streets and whitewashed houses, and the church tower that could be seen from miles away. She had left the graves of her father and her grandparents, the cemetery on the hill where generations of her family were buried, where she herself had expected to be buried someday. She would never visit those graves again, never lay flowers on her father's stone, never sit beside it and tell him about her life. The dead she had left behind were truly lost to her now, separated by an ocean that she would probably never cross again. She had left the olive trees, the groves that her family had tended for generations, the trees that had given them oil and life and a connection to the land that went back beyond memory. She had left the taste of those olives, the smell of the oil as it flowed from the press, the feeling of the rough bark beneath her hands as she climbed to pick the fruit. She had left the language of her childhood, the dialect that was spoken only in her region, that contained words and expressions that existed nowhere else. In America, she would learn English, would have to learn English, and slowly, over the years, the dialect of her village would fade, would become something she remembered, but could no longer speak fluently, a ghost of a language that lived only in her memory. She had left herself, in a way, the Maria who had grown up in that village, who had been shaped by its rhythms and its rituals and its expectations. That Maria was dying, was being transformed into something new, something that did not yet exist, something that would emerge on the other side of this crossing. She was leaving her own past behind, shedding it like a snake sheds its skin, becoming someone new whether she wanted to or not. This was the weight that Maria carried. This was the sorrow that lived beneath all the other sorrows. And it would stay with her, she knew, for the rest of her life. Even when she was happy, even when she was successful, even when she had built a new life in America and had children and grandchildren who knew nothing of Calabria, the weight would still be there. It would become lighter with time, perhaps worn smooth by the years like a stone in a river. But it would never disappear entirely. It was part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being, as much a part of who she was as her dark hair and her strong hands and her determination to survive. But the weight of leaving was balanced by the hope of arrival. Maria carried this hope with her too, held it close to her heart, used it to counter the sorrow that threatened to overwhelm her. She hoped for a better life, a life where she could earn enough to eat, to clothe herself, to live in a room with a window that let in the light. A life where she was not constantly worried about the next harvest, the next drought, the next disaster that could wipe out everything her family had worked for. A life where there was something left over after the necessities were paid for, something that could be saved something that could grow into a future. She hoped for her family. She hoped to send money home, to help her mother and her sisters survive, to give them the chance at a better life, even if they never left the village. She hoped someday to bring them to America, to reunite with them in this new world, to build something together that would last for generations. She hoped for love. She was 23 years old, unmarried, still young enough to find a husband, to have children, to create a family of her own. In the village, her prospects had been limited, the young men few and poor, the opportunities for marriage constrained by poverty and tradition. In America, perhaps things would be different. Perhaps she would meet someone who would love her, who would build a life with her, who would give her the children she had always wanted. She hoped for freedom. Freedom from the poverty that had constrained her life. Freedom from the expectations and limitations of the village. Freedom to become something new, something different. Something that she chose for herself, rather than having it chosen for her by accident of birth. These hopes sustained her through the crossing, gave her strength when she was tired, gave her courage when she was afraid, gave her reasons to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. They were not certainties, she knew. They were not guarantees. America might disappoint her, might prove to be just another place of hardship and struggle, might crush her dreams as thoroughly as the village had. But they were possibilities. They were chances. And that was more than she had ever had before. The ship sailed on, westward, always westward. And Maria sailed with it, carrying her sorrow and her hope, her memories and her dreams, her past and her future, across the gray waters of the Atlantic toward whatever awaited her on the other side. The final morning of the crossing dawned like no other. Maria felt it before she saw it, felt something different in the air, in the motion of the ship, in the quality of the light that filtered through the portholes. She sat up in her bunk and looked around, and she saw that other women were sitting up too, that everyone had felt it, that something had changed. The ship was slowing. After nearly 2 weeks of constant motion, of the endless throb of engines driving them westward, the ship was slowing down. Maria could feel it in her body, in her balance, in the way the bunks and the walls and the floor felt different beneath her. The engines were still running, but softer now, gentler, as though the ship itself knew that the journey was ending. She climbed down from her bunk and made her way to one of the portholes, pushing through the crowd of women who were already gathered there. Through the dirty glass, she could see that the sea had changed color, from the deep blue-gray of the open ocean to a lighter shade of green, the color of water that was close to land. And she could see other ships, more ships than she had ever seen in one place, moving through the water around them, heading in the same direction they were heading, toward the harbor that was still hidden beyond the horizon. Land was near. America was near. After all these days and nights, after all the suffering and the fear and the endless waiting, they were finally about to arrive. Maria returned to her bunk and began to prepare. She washed her face and hands in the basin, using the last of her clean water, scrubbing away the grime of days. She combed her hair, working through the tangles, braiding it neatly and pinning it up beneath a clean white headscarf that she had been saving for this moment. She put on her good dress, the dark blue one with the white collar, the dress that had been folded in her trunk since Naples, waiting for this day. She looked at herself in the small mirror that one of the other women had, a pocket mirror with a cracked frame. And she saw a face that was pale and thin, eyes that were shadowed with exhaustion, skin that was gray from weeks without sunlight. She did not look her best, she knew. She did not look healthy or prosperous, or like someone who would be a valuable addition to America. But she looked determined. She looked like someone who had survived something hard and was ready to survive whatever came next. Roselle was preparing too, dressing her children in their best clothes, combing their hair, wiping their faces with a damp cloth. Her daughter was fully recovered from her illness. Thank God, her cheeks pink with health, her eyes bright with excitement. Her son was trying to be brave, trying to act like a man, but Maria could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty about what was coming. They climbed the stairs together, Maria and Rosa and her children, and all the other women who were finally being allowed onto the deck to see their arrival. They emerged into the morning light, into air that was fresh and clean, into a world that was suddenly, miraculously, filled with land. America stretched before them, a coastline of beaches and forests and buildings, of smoke and activity and life. The harbor was crowded with ships, more ships than Maria had ever seen, vessels of every size and shape, from tiny fishing boats to massive steamers like their own. And there, rising from an island in the middle of the harbor, was the figure she had been dreaming of for so long. The Statue of Liberty. Capital O5 Maria stared at it, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything except take in the sight of this symbol that had meant so much to so many. The statue was green, the color of copper that has been exposed to the sea air, and it was enormous, larger than any human-made thing Maria had ever seen. The woman's face was calm, serene, as though she had seen countless ships arrive and knew that she would see countless more. Her torch was raised high, a beacon of welcome, a promise of light. Maria felt tears prick at her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Not yet. There would be time for tears later, after she had passed through Ellis Island, after she had found Giuseppe, after she was safely in America with solid ground beneath her feet. For now, she simply stood and watched and let the sight of that green goddess fill her with hope. The ship moved slowly past the statue, into the harbor, toward the piers where they would disembark. Maria watched it all, drinking in every detail, committing everything to memory. The buildings on the shore, taller than any buildings she had ever seen. The bridges that spanned the rivers, impossibly long and high. The people on the docks, tiny figures moving about their business, unaware that a ship full of new Americans was approaching. And then the ship stopped, dropping anchor in the harbor, and the process of disembarkation began. First and second class passengers first, as always, ferried to the mainland in small boats, passed through customs with minimal inspection. Then the steerage passengers, loaded onto barges and taken to Ellis Island to face the examinations that would determine their fate. Maria waited her turn. She watched the barges come and go, watched the faces of the women who had been with her for 2 weeks, watched them disappear into the system that would sort them and categorize them and decide whether they were fit to enter America. She said goodbye to Concetta, who embraced her warmly and wished her well. She said goodbye to women whose names she had never learned, women who had shared this experience with her, who would carry it with them for the rest of their lives. And then it was her turn. She walked down the gangway and onto the barge, her trunk in her hand, Rosa beside her, the children clinging to their mother's skirts. The barge was crowded, as everything had been crowded on this journey, but Maria did not mind. She was too focused on what lay ahead, too intent on the island that was growing larger with every minute. Ellis Island, the island of hope, the island of tears, the place where everything would be decided. Maria stood on the barge and watched it approach, and she felt her heart beating fast in her chest, felt her palms sweating, felt the fear and the hope that had been building for 2 weeks finally rising to a peak. This was it. This was the moment. Everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, had been leading to this. The barge docked. The immigrants disembarked. And Maria walked forward, into the building, into the examination, into the future that was waiting for her. The 4th day at sea brought a change in the weather. Maria woke to find the steerage compartment bathed in a strange golden light that filtered down through the portholes, a light that was warmer and softer than anything she had seen since boarding the ship. She sat up in her bunk and looked around, confused for a moment, wondering if she was dreaming. "The sun," Rosa said. "The sun is shining." It seemed like such a small thing, the sun. In her village, Maria had taken it for granted, had lived her whole life under its warmth without ever thinking about what it meant. But here, in this floating prison, after days of gray skies and gray water and gray everything, the sun felt like a miracle. It felt like hope made visible. The mood in the compartment lifted just a little. Women who had been lying in their bunks since Naples got up and moved around. Children who had been listless and quiet began to play in the aisles, their laughter echoing off the low ceiling. Even the smell seemed less oppressive, as though the golden light had the power to burn away some of the foulness that had accumulated in the air. When the steerage passengers were allowed on deck that morning, Maria climbed the stairs eagerly, her legs stronger than they had been on the first days. She emerged into the sunlight and stopped, blinking, her eyes watering at the brightness after so many days in the dimness below. The sky was blue, bluer than any sky she had ever seen, a deep, pure blue that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single cloud. The sea was blue too, not the gray-green of the first days, but a rich sapphire that sparkled in the light. She walked to the railing and stood there, letting the sun warm her face, feeling the wind in her hair, breathing deeply of the salt air that was so fresh and clean after the fetid atmosphere of the steerage compartment. For a moment, just a moment, she felt almost happy. She felt almost free. Around her, the other women were doing the same thing, standing at the railing, turning their faces to the sun, soaking in the warmth and the light like flowers that had been kept too long in the darkness. They did not speak much. There was no need to speak. They simply stood and breathed and existed in the moment, grateful for this small gift of beauty in the midst of their suffering. Maria found a spot at the railing and looked out at the ocean. The water was different in the sunlight, alive in a way it had not been on the gray days. She could see colors in it, shades of blue and green and purple that shifted and changed as the waves moved. She could see the foam on the crests of the waves, white and bright against the darker water. She could see the wake of the ship stretching out behind them, a long white trail that pointed back toward everything they had left behind. For the first time since leaving Naples, she thought about the future with something other than fear. She thought about America, about Giuseppe, about the life that was waiting for her. She imagined herself walking the streets of Brooklyn, working in a factory, saving money, sending for her mother and sisters. She imagined a future in which all of this suffering was just a memory, a story she would tell her children and grandchildren about the time she crossed the ocean on a steamship, the time she left the old world behind and found a new life in America. The bell rang too soon, calling them back to the darkness below, and Maria took one last look at the blue sky and the blue water before descending the stairs into the steerage compartment. But she carried the sunlight with her, held it inside her like a candle flame, let it warm her through the long hours that followed. The sixth day brought Sunday, and with it a change in the routine that Maria had not expected. The bell rang at 6 o'clock, as usual, and the women rose and washed and ate their breakfast, as usual. But after breakfast, instead of the long hours of waiting that had filled every other day, a crew member came down to announce that there would be a religious service on deck for any passengers who wished to attend. Maria had not been to Mass since leaving her village. There had been no opportunity on the ship, no priest among the passengers, no way to observe the rituals that had structured her life since childhood. The absence had weighed on her, had added to the feeling of displacement and loss that she carried with her through the days. And so when she heard about the service, she felt something stir inside her, something that was almost like relief. She climbed the stairs to the deck with the other women who wanted to attend, emerging into another gray morning, the sun of the previous day hidden behind clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon. The wind was cold, carrying the chill of the North Atlantic, and Maria wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders as she made her way to the area where the service would be held. It was not a proper Mass. There was no priest, no altar, no Eucharist. But one of the passengers, an older man from somewhere in the north of Italy, had been a seminarian in his youth and knew the prayers and the rituals. He stood at the front of the gathered crowd and led them through a simple service, reciting the prayers in Latin, leading them in hymns that Maria had known since childhood. The voices rose up into the gray sky, thin and fragile against the wind, but persistent, defiant even. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. The words were familiar, comforting, a connection to everything Maria had left behind. To her mother, who was surely saying these same words at this very moment in the church of their village. To her grandmother, who had taught her the prayers when she was a child. To all the generations of women who had prayed these prayers before her. Maria closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. Let them carry her away from the ship and the sea and the uncertainty of her future. For a few minutes, she was not an immigrant, not a steerage passenger, not a woman who had left everything she knew and loved. She was simply a soul in prayer, reaching out to something larger than herself, something that transcended the boundaries of ocean and nation and time. The service ended, and the crowd dispersed, the women making their way back toward the stairs that led to the steerage compartment. But Maria stayed for a moment longer, standing at the railing, looking out at the gray water, feeling the wind on her face. She thought about God, about whether he was listening, about whether he cared about the fate of one young woman on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. She did not know the answer. She was not sure she would ever know. But she had prayed, and that was something. That was enough. The 8th day brought a death. Maria heard about it first as a rumor, whispered from bunk to bunk in the early morning hours. Someone had died during the night in the men's compartment on the other side of the ship. An old man, they said, someone who had been sick since Naples, who had been too weak to make the journey, but had come anyway because he had nowhere else to go. The news spread through the steerage compartment like a cold wind, chilling everyone who heard it. Death was not unexpected on these voyages. Maria knew. The crossing was hard, especially on the old and the young and the sick. But knowing this did not make it easier to accept, did not diminish the horror of the thought that someone had died. Just on the other side of the iron wall that separated the men from the women, died alone in the darkness while the ship rolled on toward America. They held a burial service later that day on the deck in the gray afternoon light. Maria was allowed to attend, along with the other steerage passengers who wanted to be there. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched as the body, wrapped in canvas and weighted with chains, was slid over the side of the ship and into the sea. There was no coffin. There was no grave. The old man's body would sink to the bottom of the Atlantic, thousands of feet down, where no sunlight ever reached, where no one would ever visit his resting place. His family, if he had family, would never be able to bring flowers to his grave, would never be able to stand beside it and remember him. He would simply be gone, swallowed by the ocean, lost forever in the darkness beneath the waves. Maria thought about her own mortality as she watched the body disappear beneath the water. She thought about what it would mean to die here, on this ship, so far from home, so far from everyone who loved her. She thought about her mother, who would never know what had happened, who would wait and wonder why her daughter never arrived in America. It was a terrible thought, and Maria pushed it away, refused to dwell on it. She was young. She was healthy. She had survived the worst of the seasickness and the storm. She would make it to America. She would not be one of the bodies slipped over the side in the gray afternoon light. But the thought stayed with her anyway, lurking in the back of her mind, reminding her of how fragile life was, how easily it could be taken away. And she resolved, in that moment, to make the most of whatever time she had, to live fully, to not waste the opportunity that had been given to her. She had crossed an ocean for this chance. She would not squander it. The night before they arrived in America, no one in the steerage compartment slept. Maria lay in her bunk and listened to the sounds around her, the whispered conversations, the prayers, the excited chatter of women who were too nervous to rest. The compartment was alive with anticipation, with fear, with the strange energy that comes at the end of a long journey, when the destination is finally within reach, but not yet attained. Rosa was awake too, sitting up in her bunk with her children asleep on either side of her. She was staring at the ceiling, her lips moving silently, and Maria knew she was praying, asking for strength, asking for protection, asking for whatever help the saints and angels could provide as she faced the final test of this journey. Maria climbed down from her bunk and made her way through the darkness to where Rosa sat. She squeezed in beside her, careful not to wake the children, and took her hand. "We will make it," Maria whispered. "Both of us. Our families are waiting. We will not be turned away." Rosa squeezed her hand back, her grip tight, her fingers trembling. "I am so afraid," she said. "I have never been so afraid in my life." "I know," Maria said. "I am afraid too. But we have come so far. We have survived so much. We will survive this too. They sat together in the darkness, holding hands, drawing strength from each other. Around them, the other women were doing the same thing, reaching out to each other, forming connections that would help them face what was coming. They were strangers, most of them, women who had never met before boarding this ship. But they were bound together now by the experience they had shared, by the fear and the hope and the suffering that had marked these past 2 weeks. All around the steerage compartment, women were sharing their last stores of food with each other. The dried fruits and hard biscuits and small treasures from home that they had been rationing throughout the journey. It was a strange kind of feast, this sharing of scraps in the darkness, but it felt right, felt necessary. A final meal together before they scattered into the vastness of America. Maria shared her last dried fig with Rosa's children, watching their faces light up at the sweetness, thinking about all the children who had made this journey before them, all the children who would make it after. She thought about the children she might have someday, children who would be born in America, who would never know the village in Calabria, who would never taste olives from the trees their ancestors had tended for generations. Would she tell them about this journey? Would she describe the smell of the steerage compartment, the taste of the thin soup, the fear of the storm that had nearly killed them all? Or would she keep these memories to herself, locked away in a part of her heart that she never shared, too painful to speak aloud, too precious to forget? She did not know. She could not know. The future was a mystery, as dark and deep as the ocean that surrounded them, as unknowable as the stars that wheeled overhead in patterns she had never learned to read. But she would survive. She would make it through tomorrow, through Ellis Island, through whatever tests and trials awaited her. She had not come this far to fail. She had not sacrificed everything she knew and loved to be turned back at the last moment. Rosa was speaking to her children in a low voice, telling them about their father, reminding them of his face, his voice, the way he used to carry them on his shoulders when they were small. The children listened with wide eyes, trying to remember a man they had not seen in 5 years. A man who had become more idea than reality in the long years of his absence. "I will know him," the boy said, with a certainty that broke Maria's heart. "I will know him when I see him." "Of course you will," Rosa said. "He is your father. Your blood knows his blood. You will know him." Maria thought about Giuseppe, about whether she would know him after 3 years. About whether he would know her. She had changed on this journey, she knew. She had aged in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time. She was not the same woman who had boarded the train in Calabria, who had said goodbye to her mother and sisters on a dusty platform in the early morning light. But blood knew blood. Rosa was right about that. And whatever changes they had undergone, whatever distances they had traveled, they were still family. They would still recognize each other. The ties that bound them were stronger than time, stronger than distance, stronger than all the oceans in the world. The hours passed, and gradually, one by one, the women began to fall silent. Some of them slept, finally surrendering to exhaustion. Others simply lay in their bunks and stared at the ceiling, lost in thoughts they did not share. The children slept too, curled against their mothers, dreaming whatever dreams children dream when they are far from home and everything is strange. Maria did not sleep. She lay in her bunk and listened to the sounds of the ship, the throb of the engines, the creak of the timbers, the distant sound of the waves against the hull. These sounds had become familiar to her over the past 2 weeks, as familiar as the sounds of her village had once been. She would miss them, she realized. When she stepped off this ship and onto the solid ground of America, she would never hear these sounds again. It was a strange thing to miss, the sounds of a steerage compartment, the smells and the discomforts and the endless waiting. But they were part of her now, woven into the fabric of her experience, impossible to separate from the woman she had become. This journey had changed her. This ship had changed her, and she would carry it with her for the rest of her life. The gray light of dawn began to filter through the portholes, and Maria rose from her bunk for the last time, and she began to prepare for the day that would determine the course of her entire future. The great steamship companies had built empires on the transportation of immigrants. The Cunard Line, the White Star Line, the Hamburg America Line, the North German Lloyd, they all competed for the business of carrying human cargo from Europe to America. The Julia, the ship that carried Maria, was not one of the famous liners, not one of the great floating palaces that made headlines when they set speed records or carried famous passengers. It was a working ship, one of hundreds that plied the Atlantic routes in the 1890s, carrying coffee and olive oil westward and manufactured goods eastward, with steerage passengers packed into every available space. The shipping companies had every incentive to keep their passengers healthy enough to be admitted to America. Any immigrant who was rejected at Ellis Island had to be transported back to Europe at the company's expense. This was why they conducted their own medical examinations before boarding, why they checked for obvious signs of disease, why they turned away the obviously ill and infirm. It was not compassion that motivated them, but economics. A rejected immigrant was a financial loss. The fare for a steerage passage from Naples to New York was typically between $25 and $30 in the 1890s, a sum that represented months of wages for a laborer in southern Italy. Many immigrants could not afford even this modest sum and relied on prepaid tickets sent by relatives already in America, or on loans from immigration agents who would be repaid from the immigrants' future wages. The system was designed to extract maximum profit from the desperate and the hopeful. By the 1890s, conditions in steerage had improved somewhat from the worst days of the sailing ships, when mortality rates could reach 10% or higher. The steamships were faster, more reliable, and subject to increasingly strict regulations about the number of passengers they could carry and the conditions they had to provide. But steerage was still steerage, still the cheapest and most uncomfortable way to cross the ocean, still a place of darkness and crowding and hardship. The passengers in steerage came from every corner of Europe, but by the 1890s, the majority were from southern and eastern Europe, from Italy and Poland and Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were different from the earlier waves of immigrants, the Irish and Germans who had come in the middle of the century. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, followed different customs. And many Americans viewed them with suspicion, with fear, with a hostility that would eventually lead to the restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s. But in 1892, the doors were still open. Ellis Island had just opened its new facilities, replacing the old Castle Garden Reception Center that had been overwhelmed by the tide of arrivals. The new station could process thousands of immigrants a day, sorting them into categories, examining them for disease and disability, deciding who would be admitted and who would be turned away. It was an industrial process, efficient and impersonal, designed to handle the mass migration of peoples that was reshaping the population of America. Capital 08 Maria did not know most of this as she made her crossing. She knew only what Giuseppe had told her in his letters, what she had heard from others who had made the journey, what she could observe with her own eyes and feel with her own body. She knew that the crossing was hard, that Ellis Island was frightening, that America was both a dream and a reality that she had yet to fully comprehend. But she was learning. Every day on the ship, she learned something new about the world beyond her village, about the vastness of the ocean and the strangeness of the people who traveled across it, about the complexity of the system that would decide her fate when she arrived. She was becoming something new, something that was not quite Italian anymore, but not yet American either. She was becoming an immigrant, one of the millions who would remake themselves and their children, and their children's children in the image of a country they had never seen. There was a woman named Concetta in the bunk below Maria, an elderly woman with white hair and a face lined by decades of hard work. Concetta had been a midwife in her village for 40 years, had delivered hundreds of babies, had been present at the beginning of so many lives. Now she was going to America to live with her son, who had sent for her after his wife died, leaving him alone with 4 young children who needed a grandmother's care. Concetta did not talk much about her own feelings, about the fear and uncertainty that surely lurked beneath her calm exterior. She talked instead about her grandchildren, about the letters her son had sent describing them, about the life she hoped to build with them in a place called Philadelphia. She talked about her village, about the people she was leaving behind, about the graves of her husband and her parents that she would never be able to visit again. She talked about death, too, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who had witnessed it many times. Death comes for all of us, she told Maria one evening as they sat together in the gathering darkness of the compartment. It does not matter where we are when it finds us. What matters is how we have lived before it comes. Maria thought about these words often in the days that followed. She thought about how she had lived her own life, the small world of her village, the routine of olives and church and family. She wondered if it was enough, if she had lived well enough to face whatever end awaited her. She did not know the answer. She was not sure anyone ever knew the answer until the moment came. There was a young woman in the bunk above Maria whose name she never learned. The young woman cried every night, softly into her pillow, and she never spoke to anyone during the day. Maria tried to talk to her once, tried to offer comfort, but the young woman turned away, her face closed, her eyes empty of everything except a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. Maria wondered about her story, about what had brought her to this ship, about what was waiting for her in America, if anything was waiting at all. Perhaps she was going to join a husband who would mistreat her. Perhaps she was going alone, with no one to meet her, with nothing but a vague hope that she could find work and survive. Perhaps she had left behind a lover, a child, a life that she would never see again. Maria never learned the truth. The young woman disembarked at Ellis Island and disappeared into the crowd. One more soul swallowed by the vastness of America, one more story that would never be told. Maria thought about her sometimes, in the years that followed, wondered what had become of her, hoped that she had found some measure of happiness in this new world. But she never knew. She would never know. Capital 09. There were children everywhere in the steerage compartment, children of every age, from infants at the breast to adolescents who were nearly grown. They played in the aisles when they were allowed, ran and shouted and made nuisances of themselves, as children do. But they also suffered, perhaps more than the adults, because they did not understand what was happening to them, why they had been taken from their homes and put in this dark, rolling place that smelled of sickness and fear. Rosa's children, Marco and Lucia, became Maria's companions during the crossing. She told them stories to pass the time, stories from her village, stories from the Bible, stories she made up on the spot to distract them from the hunger and the discomfort. She taught them simple games, counting games and clapping games that required no equipment and could be played in the narrow space between the bunks. She held them when they cried and comforted them when they were frightened and tried to be, for a few days at least, the aunt they had never had. In return, they gave her something she had not expected to receive on this journey. They gave her hope. Because children believe in the future, believe that good things are coming, believe that the world is fundamentally a place of wonder and possibility. And being around them, caring for them, loving them even in this small way. Maria found herself believing too. The morning of their arrival dawned gray and cold, with a mist hanging over the water that made it impossible to see more than a few hundred yards in any direction. Maria stood on the deck with the other steerage passengers, straining her eyes for the first glimpse of land, but there was nothing to see. Only the gray water and the gray sky and the gray mist that wrapped around the ship like a shroud. And then, slowly, the mist began to lift. The sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light down to the water, illuminating patches of sea and sky with an almost supernatural brilliance. And there, emerging from the mist like a dream made solid, was the coast of America. Maria watched it appear, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything except stare at the shoreline that was growing clearer with every passing minute. She saw beaches and forests and buildings that grew larger as they approached. She saw smoke rising from chimneys, the smoke of a civilization that was larger and more complex than anything she had ever imagined. And she saw, rising above it all, the figure that would come to symbolize everything America meant to the millions who arrived on its shores. The Statue of Liberty. Maria had seen pictures of the statue, had heard it described in Giuseppe's letters, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. It was enormous, far larger than she had imagined. A woman of green copper standing on a pedestal that lifted her high above the water. She held a torch in one hand, raised toward the sky, and a tablet in the other, inscribed with words that Maria could not read. Her face was calm, serene, the face of a goddess welcoming the weary travelers to her shores. Around Maria, the other women were weeping. They were weeping with relief, with joy, with exhaustion, with all the emotions that had been building for 2 weeks and were now overflowing at the sight of this symbol of their dreams. Some of them fell to their knees and prayed. Others simply stood and stared, their faces wet with tears, their hearts full of feelings too big for words. Maria did not weep. She stood at the railing and looked at the statue, and she felt something that was deeper than tears. Capital O-10, something that was beyond expression. This was real. After all the planning and the saving and the leaving and the journey, this was real. She was here. She had made it. The ship moved slowly into the harbor, past the statue, and Maria watched it recede, watched it grow smaller as they continued toward the piers where they would disembark. She did not know if she would ever see it again, this green goddess with her torch and her tablet and her calm, serene face. But she knew she would never forget it. She knew it would stay with her for the rest of her life, a symbol of everything she had sacrificed and everything she had gained, a reminder of the moment when one life ended and another began. The ship dropped anchor in the harbor, and the process of disembarkation began. First and second-class passengers went first, ferried to the mainland in small boats, passing through customs with minimal inspection. The steerage passengers waited, as they always waited, for their turn to come. Maria returned to the steerage compartment one last time. She gathered her belongings, packed them carefully into her father's trunk, said goodbye to the bunk that had been her home for nearly 2 weeks. She found Rosa and embraced her, held her tightly, whispered words of encouragement and hope. "We will see each other again," Rosa said. "In America. We will find each other again." Maria nodded, though she was not sure she believed it. America was so large, so vast, so full of people, that finding one family among millions seemed almost impossible. But she said yes anyway, because it was what Rosa needed to hear. Because hope was all they had. Because believing in impossible things was sometimes the only way to survive. The barge came for them, and they walked down the gangway for the last time, stepped onto the flat wooden deck that would carry them to Ellis Island. Maria took her place among the crowd of emigrants, her trunk at her feet, her mother's medallion around her neck, her heart beating fast in her chest. Ahead of her, growing larger with each minute, was the island where her fate would be decided. Behind her, receding into the distance, was the ship that had carried her across the ocean. And all around her was America, vast and strange and full of possibility, waiting to receive her, waiting to see what she would become. The barge moved forward, and Maria moved with it, toward whatever future awaited her on the far shore. Waiting for her in Brooklyn, who would never know what had happened to her, who would wait and wonder why she never came. She thought about all the things she had never done, all the places she had never seen, all the children she would never have, all the life that would end here in the darkness and the cold and the endless rolling of the sea. The storm lasted for hours. Maria lost all sense of time, all sense of anything except the motion and the noise and the cold. Water that soaked through her clothes and her blanket and chilled her to the bone. She prayed, but the words seemed inadequate, seemed to disappear into the howling of the wind before they could reach whatever ears might be listening. She held her mother's medallion so tightly that the edges cut into her palm, so tightly that she could feel the warmth of her own blood mingling with the cold of the seawater. And then, gradually, the storm began to subside. The rolling became less violent. The wind dropped from a howl to a moan to a whisper. The water stopped coming in, and the sounds of the ship changed from the groaning of metal under stress to the steady throb of the engines pushing forward. Maria lay in her bunk, soaked and shivering, and listened to the quieting of the storm, and felt a gratitude so intense that it was almost painful. She was alive. Against all odds, against all expectation, she was alive. The ship had not sunk. The sea had not swallowed them. They were still moving, still crossing, still heading toward the land that waited somewhere beyond the horizon. The dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the gray beyond the portholes. The compartment was a shambles. Water stood ankle-deep in the aisles, mixed with straw and vomit and the scattered contents of trunks that had broken loose during the storm. Several women had been injured, one with a broken arm, another with a gash on her forehead that bled profusely until it was bandaged with strips torn from a petticoat. The children were pale and silent, too shocked even to cry. But they were alive. All of them, all 200 women and children in the steerage compartment, had survived the storm. Maria looked around at the faces of her fellow passengers and saw her own exhaustion reflected there, her own relief, her own stunned gratitude at simply being alive. They had made it through. They had endured. And whatever came next, they had proven that they could survive. The days after the storm were calmer. The sea smoothed itself like a tablecloth being straightened after a meal, and the ship settled into a gentle rocking that was almost soothing after the violence of the night before. The women emerged from their bunks and began the work of cleaning up, wringing out blankets and hanging them to dry on lines strung between the bunks, mopping the water from the floor, sorting through the debris to find what could be salvaged. Maria's trunk had stayed closed during the storm, held shut by the iron bands that reinforced it, and everything inside was still dry. She felt a surge of gratitude for her father, who had built this trunk so many years ago, who had made it strong enough to withstand the crossing that he himself had never made. The Bible was safe, and the photograph, and the cloth bag of food that was now nearly empty. Everything that mattered, everything she had brought from home, had survived. Rosa was not so lucky. Her trunk had burst open during the storm, and many of her belongings were damaged or lost. Her husband's letters, which she had kept tied with a ribbon, were soaked with seawater and nearly illegible. The dress she had been saving to wear when she met him was stained and torn. Only a few items had escaped unscathed, including a small wooden box that contained the wedding ring her husband had given her 5 years ago, before he left for America. Maria helped Rosa sort through the wreckage of her belongings, salvaging what could be saved, mourning what was lost. They worked in silence, their hands moving automatically, their minds elsewhere. Rosa's children sat on her bunk and watched, their faces still pale, still scared, not understanding what had happened, but knowing that something had changed, that the world was different now from what it had been before. That evening, after the meager dinner had been served and eaten, the women gathered in the center of the compartment for prayers. It was not an organized event, not led by any priest or official, but simply a gathering of women who had survived something terrible and wanted to give thanks for their survival. They said the rosary together, their voices blending into a murmur that filled the compartment, their fingers moving over the beads, their hearts lifted up in gratitude. Maria prayed with them, though she was not sure what she believed, though she was not sure that any God was listening. She prayed for the women around her, for the children who had been so frightened, for Rosa and her damaged belongings, and her husband waiting in a place called Brooklyn. She prayed for herself, for strength and courage and the will to continue. And she prayed for the baby who had died on the first night, whose mother was somewhere in this compartment, grieving silently, carrying a loss that no prayer could heal. The prayers ended, and the women drifted back to their bunks, and the compartment settled into the quiet of evening. Maria lay on her mattress and listened to the sounds around her, the breathing and sighing and occasional weeping of 200 souls crossing an ocean together. And she thought about how strange it was, this floating community of strangers, all of them thrown together by circumstance, all of them sharing this experience that would mark them for the rest of their lives. She would never forget these women. She would never forget Rosa and her children, the elderly Concetta, who had been a midwife in her village, the young woman in the bunk above who cried every night and never spoke to anyone. She would never forget the smell of the steerage compartment, the taste of the thin soup, the feel of the rough blanket against her skin. These things would become part of her, woven into the fabric of her memory, carried with her across the years, and the miles into whatever future awaited her in America. The ship sailed on, westward, always westward, toward the land that none of them had ever seen. The seventh day at sea dawned bright and clear, the sky a pale blue that deepened toward the horizon, the sun a yellow warmth that filtered down into the steerage compartment and lifted the spirits of everyone inside. Maria woke to the sound of children laughing, a sound she had not heard since the storm, and she smiled despite herself, despite the hunger and the exhaustion and the lingering fear. "It gets better," Rosa had said, and she had been right. Maria's body had adjusted to the motion of the ship. Her stomach had settled. Her muscles had learned to compensate for the constant rolling and pitching. She was still tired, still hungry, still longing for home, but the sharpest edges of her suffering had been worn down by time and repetition, and what remained was bearable, endurable, survivable. The morning routine had become automatic. Rise at the bell, wash at the basin, eat the porridge, wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The hours of nothing that stretched between meals, the time that had to be filled somehow with talk or sleep or prayer or simply staring at the walls. Maria had learned to let her mind drift during these hours, to think about the past or the future rather than the present, to live inside her memories rather than inside the steerage compartment. She thought about her village often. She thought about the olive trees and the church tower and the stone house where her mother was, probably sitting right now, wondering if her daughter had survived the storm that had surely reached the newspapers by now, praying for her safety, lighting candles before the altar of the Madonna. She thought about her sisters, about the work they were doing in her absence, about the extra burden that had fallen on their shoulders when she left. And she thought about America. She thought about Giuseppe and his letters, about the life he had described, about the streets and the buildings and the factories and the endless possibilities. She tried to imagine herself in that place, tried to picture herself walking those streets, working in those factories, speaking that strange language that Giuseppe had written about. But the pictures would not come clearly. America remained a blur, a dream, a place that existed only in words and hopes and the imagination of a woman who had never traveled more than 20 miles from her birthplace. The midday meal that day was different. In addition to the usual soup and bread, each passenger was given a small orange, a luxury so unexpected that Maria simply stared at it for a moment, not quite believing it was real. The orange was small and slightly bruised, nothing like the perfect fruit that the wealthy families in her village imported from Sicily. But it was fresh and it was sweet, and when Maria peeled it and put a section in her mouth, she felt tears spring to her eyes at the taste of something other than salt and stale bread. She ate the orange slowly, savoring each section, letting the juice run down her chin and not caring who saw. Around her, the other women were doing the same, their faces transformed by this small pleasure, this brief reminder of the world outside the steerage compartment. Rosa gave her orange to her children, who devoured it in seconds and then licked their fingers clean, searching for every last trace of sweetness. After the meal, Maria was allowed onto the deck for the daily exercise period. She climbed the stairs eagerly, her legs still weak, but stronger than they had been a few days ago, and emerged into the sunlight with a gasp of pleasure. The air was fresh and clean, the sky was blue, the sea was calm, and for a few precious minutes she could almost forget where she was, could almost believe that she was on a pleasure cruise rather than an emigrant ship. She stood at the railing and looked out at the water, and she saw something that made her heart leap. There was something floating on the surface, about 100 yards from the ship, a massive something that she could not quite identify. She squinted, trying to make it out, and then she realized what it was. Seaweed. Great mats of brown seaweed floating on the surface of the water, stretching as far as she could see in every direction. She had never seen anything like it, had not known that such things existed. And then a woman beside her, an older woman who had made the crossing before, leaned over and said, "We are getting close. This seaweed means we are near the American coast." Maria felt her heart beat faster. The American coast. They were getting close. After all these days, all these nights, all this suffering and endurance, they were finally getting close to the land they had been dreaming of, the land that had seemed so impossibly far away when they left Naples. She looked toward the west, toward the horizon where America waited, and she tried to will the land to appear, tried to make it rise up out of the water through sheer force of desire. But there was nothing there. Only the sea and the sky and the seaweed floating on the surface, and the ship that was carrying her toward her future. Soon, she whispered to herself. Soon. The 8th day brought more seaweed and more whispers of land. The women in the steerage compartment spoke of nothing else, their voices hushed with anticipation, their eyes bright with hope. Someone had seen a bird, a land bird, circling the ship in the early morning light. Someone else had noticed that the color of the water had changed from the deep blue-gray of the open ocean to a lighter shade of green. These were signs, they said. These were omens. America was near. Maria listened to the rumors, but tried not to let herself believe them too strongly. She had learned, in the days at sea, that hope could be dangerous, that disappointment could be crushing. Better to expect nothing and be surprised than to expect everything and be devastated. So she went about her daily routine, eating her porridge, washing at the basin, waiting in the endless hours between meals, trying not to think too much about what might be waiting for her beyond the horizon. But it was hard not to think about it. It was hard not to imagine the moment when she would finally set foot on solid ground, when she would finally see the country that had haunted her dreams for years. She thought about Giuseppe, about the letters he had sent, about the life he had described. She thought about the work she would find, the money she would save, the new life she would build. She thought about her mother and her sisters, about the day when she would be able to bring them to America, to give them the same chance that she had been given. And she thought about all the things that could go wrong. The medical examination at Ellis Island, where doctors looked for signs of disease, it could mean deportation. The legal inspection, where officials asked questions and made decisions that could change a person's life forever. The story she had heard of people who were turned back at the last moment, who had come all this way, only to be sent home in disgrace. She thought about these things, and she felt the fear rise in her chest, and she pushed it down, because there was nothing she could do about it, because worrying would not change anything, because all she could do was wait and hope and pray. The 9th day brought illness to Rosa's daughter. It started with a fever in the morning, a heat that Maria could feel radiating from the child's small body when she touched her forehead. By afternoon, there was a cough, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. By evening, there was a rash, small red spots that appeared first on her face and then spread down her neck and arms. Rosa was terrified. She had seen this sickness before, in her village in Sicily, and she knew what it could mean. Measles, perhaps, or scarlet fever, or any of a dozen diseases that could spread through the close quarters of the steerage compartment like fire through dry grass. But more than the disease itself, she feared what it would mean when they arrived at Ellis Island. A sick child could be detained, quarantined, separated from her family. A sick child could mean deportation for the entire family, sent back to Italy after coming all this way. She begged the other women not to report the illness, not to tell the crew members who came down every day to check on the passengers. She held her daughter in her arms and rocked her and sang to her and prayed for her recovery, prayed for the fever to break before they reached America, prayed for a miracle that would allow her family to stay together. But one of the women, frightened for her own children, went to the crew and reported the sick child. Within the hour, 2 sailors came down to the steerage compartment and took Rosa's daughter to the ship's sick bay, a small room somewhere on one of the upper decks, where the ill were isolated from the healthy. Rosa screamed and cried and tried to follow them, but they would not let her go. Mothers could not stay with their children in the sick bay, they said. It was against the rules. Rosa collapsed on the floor of the compartment, sobbing, while her son clung to her and cried, and Maria knelt beside her and held her hand and tried to offer comfort that she knew was inadequate. Maria stayed with Rosa through that long night, holding her hand, listening to her cry, saying the words that people say in such situations, words about faith and hope and the power of prayer, words about doctors and medicine and the resilience of children, words that Maria was not sure she believed, but that she spoke anyway because there was nothing else to do, because silence would have been worse. The next morning, a crew member came down to tell Rosa that her daughter was improving. The fever had broken in the night. The rash was beginning to fade. She would be kept in the sick bay for another day or 2, but she was expected to make a full recovery. Rosa wept again, this time with relief, and Maria wept with her, and for a moment the steerage compartment was filled with something other than fear and despair. Rosa's daughter was returned to her on the 11th day, thin and pale but alive. Rosa held her so tightly that Maria thought the child might break, held her and cried and whispered thanks to God and all the saints she could name. The other women gathered around, touching the girl's head, saying prayers of thanksgiving, offering small gifts of food and comfort. It was a moment of joy in a place that had known too little joy, a reminder that sometimes things turned out better than expected, that sometimes prayers were answered, that sometimes miracles happened. Maria watched Rosa and her daughter and felt something shift inside her, some hard knot of fear that had been sitting in her chest for days finally beginning to loosen. If Rosa's daughter could survive, if she could recover from her illness and be returned to her mother, then maybe everything would be all right. Maybe they would all make it through. Maybe America was not a dream that would shatter the moment she tried to grasp it, but a real place, a possible place, a place where new lives could begin. Soon. She told herself. Soon. The 10th day brought rumors of land. The 11th day brought the sight of it. Maria was standing on the deck during the morning exercise period when she first saw the dark line on the horizon, the unmistakable shape of a coastline rising up from the gray water. She stared at it for a long moment, not quite believing her eyes, not quite trusting that it was real. And then she heard the other women around her, gasping and crying and pointing toward the west, and she knew that it was true. It was America. They had arrived. The ship did not approach the land immediately. It sailed parallel to the coast for several hours, moving south toward the harbor of New York, and Maria watched from the deck as the coastline unfolded before her. She saw beaches and cliffs and forests of trees that she could not identify. She saw houses and buildings and structures that seemed impossibly large, even at this distance. She saw smoke rising from chimneys, the smoke of a civilization that was larger and more complex than anything she had ever imagined. And then she saw the harbor itself, the great bay where the ships came in, crowded with vessels of every size and shape. She saw the piers stretching out into the water, the warehouses and factories lining the shore, the bridges spanning the rivers that fed into the bay. And rising above it all, standing on a small island in the middle of the harbor, she saw the Statue of Liberty. The statue was larger than she had imagined, larger than anything she had ever seen. It rose up from the water like a goddess, a figure of green copper holding a torch aloft, standing on a pedestal that seemed to lift her halfway to the sky. Maria had seen pictures of the statue in newspapers and pamphlets, had heard Giuseppe describe it in his letters. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of it, for the sheer scale and majesty of the thing. Around her, the other women were weeping. They were weeping with relief, with joy, with exhaustion, with fear, with all the emotions that had been building for 12 days and were now overflowing. Rosa was holding her children, one in each arm, pointing toward the statue and telling them, "Look, look, that is America. That is where Papa is waiting for us." The elderly Concetta was crossing herself and saying prayers of thanksgiving, tears streaming down her weathered face. Even the young woman who had cried every night was smiling, her face transformed by something that looked almost like hope. Maria did not weep. She stood at the railing and looked at the statue and felt something that was deeper than tears, something that was beyond expression. This was real. After all the planning and the saving and the leaving and the journey, this was real. She was here. She had made it. Whatever happened next, she had crossed the ocean, and she was alive. And the future was waiting for her Dot. The ship moved slowly into the harbor, past the statue, past islands and piers and buildings that grew larger and more detailed as they approached. The noise of the city reached them even here, a distant roar of humanity that was nothing like anything Maria had ever heard. She could smell the city, too, a mixture of smoke and salt and something else, something chemical and industrial that she would later learn was the smell of progress, the smell of modernity, the smell of America. The ship did not go directly to a pier. Instead, it anchored in the harbor, and the passengers were told to prepare for disembarkation. The first and second class passengers would go first, as they always did, ferried to the mainland where they would pass through customs with minimal inspection. The steerage passengers would wait. They would be loaded onto barges and taken to Ellis Island, where they would undergo the examinations that would determine whether they were fit to enter the country. Maria returned to her bunk and gathered her belongings. She packed her things back into her father's trunk, the Bible and the photograph, and the empty cloth bag that had once held figs and biscuits. She folded the rough blanket and left it on the mattress, a final farewell to the bed that had been her home for nearly 2 weeks. She straightened her dress, the good blue one with the white collar, and smoothed her hair and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. She took her mother's medallion from her pocket and held it for a moment, feeling the smooth silver warm in her palm. "Holy Mary," she whispered, "Mother of God, protect me, guide me, help me to pass through this final test." And then she hung the medallion around her neck, tucking it beneath her collar, where it would rest against her skin, close to her heart. The time had come. The journey across the ocean was over. And the next journey, the journey through Ellis Island and into America, was about to begin. The barge came for them in the early afternoon. It was a flat-bottomed vessel, little more than a floating platform, with railings around the edges, and it was already crowded with steerage passengers from the men's compartment on the other side of the ship. Maria walked down the gangway and stepped onto the barge, feeling solid wood beneath her feet for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, feeling the strange stability of something that did not roll and pitch with the waves. The barge was even more crowded than the steerage compartment had been. Maria found herself pressed between Rosa and a woman she did not know, their bodies touching on all sides, the smell of sweat and anxiety filling the air. There was no place to sit. There was barely room to stand. And yet no one complained, because ahead of them, growing larger with each minute, was Ellis Island, the gateway to America. The island was smaller than Maria had expected. From the ship, it had looked imposing, a substantial piece of land with large buildings rising from its shores. But now, as the barge approached, she could see how crowded it was, how every inch of space seemed to be occupied by buildings or piers or people. There were thousands of people on that island, she realized. Thousands of immigrants, all of them waiting to be processed, all of them waiting to learn if they would be allowed to stay or sent back to where they came from. The main building was an impressive structure, built of red brick with towers at each corner that made it look almost like a castle or a fortress. It had been completed only a few years ago. Maria had heard, to replace an earlier building that had burned down. It was designed to handle the enormous numbers of immigrants who were arriving in America every day, the endless stream of humanity that flowed from every corner of Europe to this single point of entry. The barge docked at one of the piers, and the immigrants began to disembark. They walked in a long line, carrying their bundles and their children, moving slowly toward the entrance of the main building. Officials in uniform directed them, pointing and shouting instructions in a language that Maria could not understand. She followed the person in front of her, trusting that the line knew where it was going, that she would end up where she was supposed to be. Inside the building, the immigrants were directed toward a flight of stairs. Maria began to climb, her trunk balanced on her shoulder, feeling the weight of it with each step. The stairs seemed to go on forever, and her legs burned from the effort, and her breath came in short gasps. But she noticed that there were men in uniform watching them climb, watching how they moved, studying their faces and their bodies for signs of weakness or disease. She realized that this was the first part of the examination, that anyone who struggled too much on the stairs would be marked for further inspection. She kept her face calm and her pace steady. She did not stumble. She did not stop to rest. She climbed the stairs with her trunk on her shoulder and her head held high, and she did not give them any reason to single her out. At the top of the stairs was a large hall, the largest indoor space Maria had ever seen. The ceiling soared above her, vaulted and grand, supported by columns that seemed to reach toward the heavens. Great windows lined the walls, letting in the gray afternoon light, and the floor was filled with rows of metal railings that divided the space into channels. The immigrants were herded into these channels, forming long lines that snaked back and forth across the vast hall, moving slowly toward the desks where the inspectors sat. This was the registry hall, the heart of Ellis Island, the place where the fate of every immigrant was decided. Maria took her place in one of the lines and began to wait. The waiting seemed endless. The line moved forward a few feet and stopped, moved forward again, and stopped again. Maria could see the inspectors at their desks far ahead, small figures in the distance, making decisions that would change people's lives forever. She could see people being pulled out of the line and led away to other rooms, their faces white with fear, their families calling after them. She could hear children crying, women praying, men muttering in languages she did not recognize. The air in the hall was thick with anxiety, with the smell of bodies packed too closely together, with the weight of thousands of hopes and fears all pressing down at once. Maria stood in line and waited, and tried not to think about what would happen if she failed, if she was marked for deportation, if she was sent back across the ocean to a life that had nothing left to offer her. The medical examination came first. Maria stood before a doctor in a white coat, a tired-looking man with gray hair and spectacles, who examined her with quick, practiced movements. He looked at her face, her hands, her scalp. He pulled down her lower eyelid with a small metal hook, a button hook, peering at the tissue beneath, checking for the telltale signs of trachoma, an eye disease that was grounds for immediate deportation. The hook was cold and uncomfortable, and Maria's eyes watered. But she did not flinch, did not pull away, did not give him any reason to mark her for further examination. He listened to her breathing, watched her walk a few steps, noted her general appearance and demeanor, and then he nodded and waved her on. No chalk mark on her clothing, no letter to indicate that something was wrong. She had passed. The first test was over, but there was another test to come, the legal examination, where an inspector would ask her questions and determine whether she was fit to enter the country. Maria had been preparing for this moment for weeks, practicing her answers in her head, memorizing the responses that Giuseppe had told her to give in his letters. She knew what questions would be asked. She knew what answers she should give. But knowing and doing were different things, and as she shuffled forward in the line toward the inspector's desk, she felt her heart pounding in her chest, her palms sweating, her mouth going dry with fear. The inspector was a young man, perhaps 30, with a thin mustache and a bored expression. He sat behind a high desk, surrounded by piles of papers, looking down at Maria with eyes that showed no interest, no sympathy, no recognition that she was a person rather than a piece of cargo to be processed. Beside him sat an interpreter, an Italian man who would translate the questions and answers, who would serve as the bridge between Maria's language and the language of her new country. The questions came quickly, one after another. What is your name? Maria Benedetto. How old are you? 23. Where are you from? Monteleone, in the province of Calabria. Can you read and write? Yes. The inspector handed her a piece of paper with a few sentences printed in Italian. Maria read them aloud, slowly but accurately, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a passage from a newspaper, something about a fire in a factory. She read it without stumbling, without hesitation, and the inspector made a note on his papers. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? No. Are you an anarchist? No. Do you have a job waiting for you in America? No. Maria said no, because she had been told to say no, because saying yes would mean she was a contract laborer, which was illegal, which could get her sent back. Who is meeting you? My brother, Giuseppe Benedetto. He lives in Brooklyn. What is his address? Maria recited the address that Giuseppe had written in his letters, the address she had memorized weeks ago, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. How much money do you have? Maria pulled out her small cloth purse and showed the inspector the coins inside. $18.40. All that remained of the fortune she had spent 2 years saving. The inspector counted the coins himself, his fingers moving quickly, his face expressionless. For a long moment, he said nothing. He looked at her papers, looked at her face, looked at the coins in her purse. The silence stretched out, filling the space between them, pressing down on Maria's chest until she could barely breathe. Had she done something wrong? Had she said the wrong thing? Was she going to be turned back after all this way, after all this suffering? And then the inspector picked up his stamp and brought it down on her papers, a single decisive motion that seemed to echo through the entire hall. She had passed. She was admitted. She was allowed to enter the United States of America. Maria walked through a doorway and down another flight of stairs, the stairs they called the stairs of separation, because it was here that the paths diverged. Some people went one way to be detained for further examination. Others went another way to be deported back to where they came from. And the lucky ones, like Maria, went straight ahead through a door marked with words she could not read. She pushed the door open and stepped through, and suddenly she was outside, in the open air, with the sounds of the city around her and the ground firm beneath her feet. She was in America. The area outside the main building was crowded with people, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some were immigrants like Maria, newly arrived, their faces pale and dazed from the journey, their clothes rumpled and dirty from weeks at sea. Others were Americans, people who had come to meet the arriving ships, to find their relatives among the masses of humanity that passed through Ellis Island every day. They were calling out names, holding up signs, pushing through the crowd in search of the faces they had been waiting for. Maria stood on the steps of the building and looked out at the chaos, searching for Giuseppe. She had not seen her brother in 3 years, and she was not sure she would recognize him now, after all this time. People changed in 3 years. America changed them. And the photograph she carried in her trunk was old, taken before Giuseppe had left, showing a young man who no longer existed. And then she heard her name. Maria, Maria, The voice came from somewhere in the crowd, a voice that was familiar and strange at the same time. A voice she had not heard in 3 years, but had never forgotten. She scanned the faces, searching, desperate, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw him. Giuseppe was standing near a lamppost at the edge of the crowd, waving his arm, his face split by a grin that made him look like the boy she had grown up with. He was thinner than she remembered, his face lined with the marks of hard work, his clothes American and strange. But his eyes were the same, dark and warm, the eyes of her brother, the eyes of home. She dropped her trunk and ran toward him, pushing through the crowd, not caring who she jostled or who stared at her. And then he was there, his arms around her, holding her so tightly that she could barely breathe. And she was crying, finally crying, all the tears she had held back during the journey pouring out of her now. "You made it," Giuseppe said, over and over. "You made it. You are here. You are safe." "I made it," Maria whispered. "I am here." And for a long moment, they simply held each other. Brother and sister reunited after years of separation, standing in the shadow of Ellis Island while the world flowed around them, while other families found each other and wept and laughed and began their new lives. Giuseppe took Maria to his apartment in Brooklyn. They traveled by ferry across the harbor and then by elevated train through the streets of the city, and Maria pressed her face to the window and stared at everything she saw. The buildings were so tall, so many of them, crowding against each other like trees in a forest. The streets were so busy, filled with people and horses and carriages and things that moved on their own, without horses, machines that Giuseppe said were called automobiles. The noise was tremendous, a roar of voices and wheels and engines that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a tenement building on a narrow street in a neighborhood called Red Hook. The building was 5 stories tall, crammed between other buildings just like it, so close together that the sun never reached the lower floors. The stairs were narrow and dark, and smelled of cooking and bodies, and the lives of hundreds of people who had passed through before. The apartment itself was small, 2 rooms that Giuseppe shared with 2 other men from their region. There was a kitchen with a stove and a table and a few chairs, and a bedroom with 3 narrow beds pushed against the walls. Maria would sleep in the kitchen, Giuseppe explained, on a cot that he had borrowed from a neighbor. It was not much, he said apologetically, but it was temporary. She would find work soon, and then she could afford a room of her own. Maria looked around at the cramped space, so different from the stone house in her village, so different from anything she had ever known. The walls were thin, and she could hear the neighbors on every side, their voices and their footsteps, and the sounds of their lives. The window looked out onto an air shaft, a narrow space between buildings where the light barely reached. There was no view of the sky, no view of trees or hills or anything green. But it was America. It was the beginning of her new life. And that was enough. Giuseppe made coffee, and they sat at the small table in the kitchen and talked. He told her about his life here, about the factory where he worked 12 hours a day making shirts, about the neighborhood and its shops and churches and the other Italians who lived there. He told her about the things she would need to learn, the English words that were essential for survival, the customs that were different from home. He told her about the dangers, too, about the people who would try to cheat her, about the neighborhoods she should avoid, about the ways that America could hurt those who were not careful. Maria listened and tried to absorb it all, but she was exhausted, more exhausted than she had ever been in her life. The journey had taken everything out of her, and now that it was over, now that she was safe, her body was demanding rest. Her eyes kept closing, and her head kept nodding, and finally Giuseppe smiled and told her to sleep. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow we will begin." Maria lay down on the narrow cot and pulled the blanket over her. The sounds of the city came through the thin walls, voices and footsteps, and the distant clatter of the elevated train. They were strange sounds, unfamiliar, nothing like the quiet of her village or the rhythm of the ship. But she was too tired to care, too tired to do anything but close her eyes and let sleep take her. And as she drifted off, she thought about the journey, about all the miles she had traveled, about all the things she had endured. She thought about her mother and her sisters, about the village she had left behind, about the life that was now part of her past. And she thought about the future, about the life that was waiting for her here, about all the things she had yet to learn and do and become. She was in America. She had made it. And tomorrow, whatever it held, she would be ready. The first weeks in America were a blur of new experiences, new sensations, new challenges that seemed to come at Maria from every direction. She learned to navigate the streets of her neighborhood, to find her way to the market and the church and the factory where she would soon be working. She learned to recognize the sounds of the city, the rumble of the elevated trains, the shouts of the pushcart vendors, the constant hum of humanity that never seemed to stop. She learned English, slowly at first, word by word and phrase by phrase. Giuseppe taught her the basics, the words she needed to buy bread and ask for directions and understand the orders that would be given to her at work. The other women in the neighborhood helped too, the ones who had been here longer and had already made the transition from immigrant to American. They spoke to her in a mixture of Italian and English, correcting her pronunciation, laughing gently at her mistakes, encouraging her to try again. She found work in a garment factory on the Lower East Side, a large room filled with sewing machines, and the women who operated them. The work was hard, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, bent over a machine and stitching seams until her fingers ached and her eyes burned. The pay was poor, barely enough to cover her share of the rent and food, with a little left over to save or send home. But it was work, honest work, and it was more than she could have earned in her village in a year of tending olive trees. She wrote letters home every week, long letters that described everything she was seeing and doing and learning. She wrote about the apartment and the neighborhood and the factory and the strange new foods she was learning to eat. She wrote about Giuseppe and how he had grown, about the other Italians who lived nearby and the community they had built in this corner of America. She wrote about her hopes for the future, about the money she was saving, about the day when she would be able to bring her mother and sisters to join her. And she wrote about the things she missed: the olive trees on the terraced hillside, the church bells ringing at dawn, the smell of her mother's cooking, the faces of the sisters she had left behind. She wrote about the ache that lived in her chest, the homesickness that never quite went away, the longing for a place and a time that no longer existed. But she did not write about the hardships. She did not write about the long hours and the low pay and the exhaustion that made it hard to get out of bed in the morning. She did not write about the cold of the winter, WORSE, than anything she had experienced in Italy, or the heat of the summer, trapped in the factory with no fresh air. She did not write about the loneliness, about the nights when she lay in her cot and cried for everything she had lost. These things were true, but they were not the whole truth, and her family did not need to know them. They needed hope, not worry. They needed to believe that she was happy, that America was everything they had dreamed it would be. And so she wrote them letters full of hope and saved her tears for the darkness of the night. The months passed, and Maria began to feel like she belonged. She learned the rhythms of her new life, the routine of work and rest, and the small pleasures that made it bearable. She made friends among the other women at the factory, girls from villages all over southern Italy who had made the same journey she had made, who understood what it meant to be far from home. She found a church where she could attend Mass on Sundays, a small storefront chapel where the priest spoke. Italian and the familiar rituals of her faith provided comfort in a world that was still strange. She watched the seasons change, spring turning to summer, turning to fall, and she thought about how different everything was from the seasons she had known in Calabria. The trees here were different, the birds were different, even the light was different, filtered through the smoke and haze of the city rather than the clear air of the hills. But it was still beautiful in its own way. And it was her home now, this corner of Brooklyn, this small apartment in a crowded building, this life she was building day by day. A year passed. Then two. Maria worked and saved and sent money home and wrote letters full of hope. She learned to speak English well enough to get by, to navigate the city, to deal with the foreman at the factory without needing an interpreter. She grew older, harder, more American, though she never stopped being Italian, never lost the accent or the habits or the memories of the village where she had been born. And she never forgot the journey. She never forgot the steerage compartment, the rolling of the ship, the smell of sickness and despair. She never forgot Rosa and her children, the elderly Concetta, the young woman who had cried every night. She never forgot the storm that had nearly killed them, or the sight of the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor, or the moment when she had pushed through the door at Ellis Island and stepped out into America. These things stayed with her, became part of her, shaped who she was and who she would become. They were the foundation of her new life, the price she had paid for the chance at something better. And whenever she was tired, whenever she was lonely, whenever she wondered if it had all been worth it, she remembered that journey, and she knew that it had. She was here. She had made it. And that was enough. And now, as the night grows late and the city sleeps, let us leave Maria to her new life in America. The journey across the ocean is over. The days in the steerage compartment, the rolling of the ship, the smell of bodies and vomit and tar, the thin soup and the hard bread, the storm that shook the vessel and filled the hold with water, the rumor of land, the sight of the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor, the stairs at Ellis Island, the questions of the inspectors, the moment of passing through the golden door. All of it is behind her now. Ahead lies a life she cannot yet imagine, a life of work and struggle and small joys and great sorrows. A life that will become, over time, the foundation of a family, of descendants who will never know the village in Calabria, who will never taste the olives from the trees her family tended, who will call themselves American without knowing all that the word contains. But that is the future. And this is the night. Maria is sleeping now in a small apartment in Brooklyn, in a city that is slowly becoming her home. The sounds of America come through the thin walls, the rumble of trains and the voices of neighbors and the distant whisper of the ocean that she crossed to get here. She is breathing slowly, deeply, the breathing of someone who has earned her rest, who has survived what needed to be survived, who has found her way to a new shore. And you, listening to this voice in your own darkness, you are safe too. You are in your own bed, in your own home, in your own life that is so different from Maria's and yet connected to it in ways you may never fully understand. Perhaps you are a descendant of someone who made that crossing, who stood on the deck of a steamship and watched the Statue of Liberty emerge from the fog. Perhaps your ancestors came from a different place, by a different route, at a different time. It does not matter. We are all immigrants, in a sense, all travelers making our way through a world that is always changing, always strange, always full of the unknown. The night is quiet now. The city is sleeping. The ocean that Maria crossed is still out there, somewhere beyond the lights of the harbor, dark and vast and full of memory. Other ships are crossing it even now, carrying other passengers toward other shores, continuing the endless story of departure and arrival that has shaped the world we live in. But that is their story, and this one is over. Close your eyes now. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the warmth of the place where you are lying. You are safe. You are here. And the journey, whatever journey brought you to this moment, is over for now. The archives are closed. Sleep well, and dream of whatever harbor waits for you on the far shore of your own crossing. The memory of the crossing epilogue years later. When Maria was an old woman living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she would sometimes think about the crossing. The memories would come to her unbidden, rising up from the depths of her mind like bubbles from the bottom of a deep well. She would remember the smell of the steerage compartment, that combination of vomit and sweat and tar, and bodies that had seemed so overwhelming at the time, but that she could now recall only as a faint echo, a ghost of a sensation. She would remember the taste of the thin soup and the hard bread, the gnawing hunger that had never quite gone away, the sweetness of the dried figs her mother had packed for her. She would remember Rosa, her friend from Sicily, and wonder whatever had become of her. They had promised to find each other in America, to stay in touch, to be friends forever. But America was vast, and life was busy, and the promise had never been kept. Rosa had disappeared into the millions, one more immigrant swallowed by the great machine of American life. She would remember the storm, the terror of that night when she had thought she would die, when the ship had rolled and pitched, and the water had poured in, and the women had screamed and prayed. She would remember the moment when the storm had ended, when she had realized that she was still alive, that she had survived. She would remember the first sight of the Statue of Liberty, rising from the harbor like a goddess, green and serene and impossibly beautiful. She would remember the tears that had streamed down the faces of the women around her, the prayers of thanksgiving, the overwhelming feeling that they had made it, that they had crossed an ocean and survived. She would remember Giuseppe, waiting for her outside Ellis Island, his face split by a smile that she had carried in her heart for years. She would remember the embrace, the tears, the words that had failed them both, because no words could express what they felt. She would remember all of this, and she would think about how far she had come, how much she had changed, how different her life was from what it would have been if she had stayed in Calabria. Her children spoke English as their first language. Her grandchildren did not speak Italian at all. They were Americans now, fully and completely, with no memory of the village on the hillside, the olive trees, the church with its bell tower. And she would think about the other immigrants, the millions who had made the same crossing, who had passed through Ellis Island, who had built the country that her grandchildren called home. They were all connected, she knew, all part of the same great story, the story of people who had left everything behind for the chance at something better. The crossing had been hard. She would never pretend otherwise. It had been one of the most difficult experiences of her life, 2 weeks of suffering and fear and uncertainty. But it had also been the most important thing she had ever done. It had been the moment when she had taken control of her own destiny, when she had decided that her life would be different from her mother's and her grandmother's, when she had stepped out of the past and into the future. She would carry that crossing with her always. It was part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being, as much a part of who she was as her name or her face. And when she died, as she knew she would die someday, she hoped that something of that journey would live on, in her children and her grandchildren, and their children after them. She hoped that they would remember, or if not remember, at least honor, the sacrifice that had made their lives possible. The crossing, the ship, the steerage compartment, the storm, the statue, the island, the door marked with words she could not read, the moment when she had stepped through and found herself in America. These things had happened a long time ago, but they were still happening, in a way. They were still part of her story, still part of who she was. And they would be part of her story forever, as long as there was anyone left to remember, as long as there was anyone left to tell the tale. And now, as the night grows late and the world sleeps, let us leave Maria to her memories, to her dreams, to the long life she built in America, the life that began on a ship crossing an ocean, the life that began when she pushed through a door and found herself in a new world. The archives are closed. Sleep well, and may your own crossing, whatever form it takes, carry you safely to the far shore.